The farmhouse had been rotting for 11 years before Teresa Vann ever laid eyes on it. She drove past it twice on the same afternoon, slowing each time, craning her neck through the cracked passenger window of her sister's borrowed Corolla. The mailbox at the end of the gravel driveway had collapsed sideways into a clump of wild blackberries, its rusted post swallowed by a decade of untended growth. The number painted on it, 4 and 2, and a faded smear that might have been a 6, had bleached down to almost nothing. The driveway itself had mostly returned to earth, 2 faint tracks separated by a ridge of weeds gone brown in the November cold. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She pulled over the second time and sat with the engine idling. Her daughter Parcel was asleep in the back seat, 7 years old, wrapped in a fleece blanket printed with cartoon llamas that they'd found at a church rummage sale the summer before. One small sneaker had fallen off her foot and wedged itself between the seat and the door. Teresa looked at her in the rearview mirror for a long moment before she looked back at the farmhouse. It sagged. That was the only word for it. The front porch leaned to the right as though someone had pushed it gently from the left, and it had simply never recovered. One of the upstairs windows was covered with a rectangle of plywood that had warped and pulled away from the frame on one side, flapping faintly in the wind. The roof over the north end of the house showed a sunken area, a depression in the shingles that suggested the structure beneath had given way. A gutter hung from one bracket, dangling at an angle like a broken arm. The listing price was printed on the paper she had folded in her jacket pocket. $12,000. The real estate office in Clement had taken 3 days to call her back. The agent, a man named Devin who sounded both apologetic and faintly amused, had described it as a fixer-upper with significant deferred maintenance and had mentioned twice that she might want to have a structural engineer take a look before making any decisions. He said the previous owner had passed away 4 years prior, and the county had taken the property for back taxes. He said it had been on and off the market for going on 3 years. He said, and she could hear the careful politeness in his voice, that it wasn't really a turnkey situation. Teresa had said she understood and asked if she could see it on Saturday. She was 31 years old, and she had $520 in a checking account and a little over $300 more in a coffee can she kept inside her winter boot in the closet of her sister Donna's spare bedroom. She had a daughter who needed her own room and a sister who loved her, but whose patience was not infinite, and whose husband Dale had started leaving job listings on the kitchen table with certain entries circled in red pen. She had a car that wasn't technically hers, a phone with a cracked screen, and a debt to a medical collection agency that sent letters in envelopes made of a slightly different shade of white than regular mail. So she always knew what they were before she opened them. What she did not have was a plan that made any conventional sense. The farmhouse had come to her attention through a notice stapled to the community board at the laundromat on Birch Street, the kind of handwritten paper notice that most people looked through rather than at. It was printed in blue marker on lined notebook paper, which was maybe why she stopped. She was folding Marisol's school clothes, and she looked up, and there it was. Property tax auction surplus listing. County land transfer program. Reduced qualifying properties. And then a number to call. She had stood holding a pair of Marisol's socks and read it 3 times. This was in October. By November, she was sitting outside what the county land office had referred to, with government-issue blandness, as Parcel 426 on Sycamore Gap Road. Her sister Donna, when she'd heard about it, had set down her coffee mug with the particular care that meant she was trying not to say something she'd regret. Teresa, Donna had said finally. I know, Teresa said. You don't have $12,000. I have almost $800. Donna looked at her for a long time. And I'm going to ask about a payment arrangement. Teresa. Donna's voice had gone quiet in the way it did when she was genuinely worried rather than just exasperated. It's a condemned building. It's not condemned. I checked with the county clerk. It's listed as uninhabitable pending inspection. That's not the same. How is that not the same? Because condemned means there's a demolition order. Uninhabitable pending inspection means someone has to go look at it. Donna had stared at her. And you think what? That you'll just fix it up? Teresa had said yes. She'd said it the way you say things when the believing has to come before the evidence, when you can't afford to wait for certainty. Her mother-in-law, which is to say Marco's mother, which is to say a woman named Greta who had never fully forgiven Teresa for something she'd never clearly articulated, had heard about the farmhouse through Donna, who should have known better than to mention it. Greta had called on a Tuesday evening when Marisol was in the bath. "I hear you're buying a condemned house," Greta said. "It's not condemned," Teresa said for the second time in 2 weeks. "You're going to raise my granddaughter in a falling-down barn. It's a farmhouse." Teresa. Greta said her name with a particular inflection that managed to communicate both pity and disappointment in a single word, a talent she'd spent years refining. Marco would be horrified. Teresa had stood in Donna's kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and the sound of Marisol splashing in the tub down the hall, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Marco isn't here, Greta, so I'm doing what I can with what I have." And then she ended the call. She thought about that moment now, sitting outside the farmhouse in the gray November light. Marco had been gone for 2 years. A work accident, which was the phrase she used because the full version was harder to say, and people got uncomfortable in ways that made her feel worse rather than better. He had been 29 years old. The life insurance had covered the funeral and 3 months of rent, and then it was gone. And after that had come the slow, grinding arithmetic of surviving on what she could earn doing bookkeeping for small businesses at $40 an hour, which sounded reasonable until you factored in that Marisol needed after-school care, and after-school care cost money, and money was what she did not have enough of. The farmhouse listing had seemed, the first time she read it, like something between a possibility and a hallucination. The second time she read it, late at night in Donna's spare bedroom with Marisol asleep beside her, she felt something shift. Not hope exactly. Something quieter and more stubborn than hope. A sense that this particular door was open and might not stay that way. She got out of the car. The November air was cold and carried the smell of turned earth from somewhere across the fields. She walked up the driveway, her feet finding the firm ground between the weed ridges, and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Up close, the damage was worse and also, somehow, more comprehensible. She could see the individual things that had gone wrong over years of neglect. The porch boards soft from water, the railing post rotted at its base. These were not catastrophic failures. They were accumulated ones, the kind of damage that comes from nothing being done for a very long time. She put her hand on the porch railing, and it gave slightly under her palm. She did not let go. The front door was locked with a padlock through a hasp, the county's standard closure for properties in their land transfer program. She walked around the side of the house slowly, looking at the foundation, at the siding, at the place where the roof over the north end had settled. The siding was original board and batten, she thought, which was a detail she recognized from her father's habit of watching home improvement programs on the weekends when she was a child. Some of it had split and pulled away, but the boards that were intact looked like they were made of something heavier and older than modern lumber. The foundation was stone, not poured concrete, stone. Cut and laid, old work, probably original to whenever the house was first built. She walked along it, looking for cracking or separation. There was some, in 2 places, but less than she'd feared. The ground around the foundation had a particular evenness to it, the kind that suggested the structure had settled long ago and then largely held. Around the back of the house, she found the barn. She hadn't expected the barn. It stood about 60 feet behind the house, separated from it by what had once been a kitchen garden, now a tangle of dead stems and wild grass. The barn was in better shape than the house in some ways, and worse in others. The roof had held, mostly, and the main doors were still on their hinges, which told her something about the quality of the hardware, if not the wood. But several boards on the south wall had blown out at some point, leaving openings you could put your arm through. She could see where animals had been using the barn as shelter. There were feathers on the floor visible through a gap between the doors. She stood looking at it for a while. Then she went back to the car, got in without waking Marisol, and sat with her hands on the steering wheel. The next morning she called Devin at the real estate office and asked if she could have a contractor take a look before she made a formal offer. Devin sounded surprised that she was still interested, then covered it with professional smoothness and said he'd arrange access. She called a man named Hector Ruiz who had done small repair jobs in Donna's house twice, and who she knew worked cheaply when the situation warranted it. She asked him if he'd take a look at a property with her as a favor and pay her back in home-baked meals, which was an offer she made without full certainty that her baking was worth the trade, but Hector said yes anyway. They went on a Thursday afternoon. Marisol was at school. Hector walked through the house slowly, knocking on walls, pressing his palms to the floor, shining a flashlight up into the ceiling cavities where he could find access. He did not say much while he was looking, which Teresa had learned was a sign that he was forming an opinion rather than that the opinion was bad. She followed him quietly, carrying a small notebook where she wrote down the things he pointed out. In the kitchen, he spent a long time looking at the ceiling, at the water staining and the soft spot in the plaster above the north window. He pressed on the plaster, and it flexed in a way that made her stomach tighten. "Roof's leaking up there," he said. "Probably been leaking for years. But the framing above it," he tapped the ceiling with his knuckle, "sounds solid. Whoever built this house used real lumber. Not dimensional. This is full cut, old growth. Different animal." "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means the bones are good," he said. She wrote that down. Bones are good. In the bathroom, the floor had gone soft. Near the toilet, a classic sign of a slow leak that had eventually won. The toilet itself, when she opened the tank, had a float that someone had long ago replaced with an inverted styrofoam cup, which she found both resourceful and troubling. The bathtub was a cast iron clawfoot, buried under grime but intact, and when she ran her finger along the interior, she found the enamel was still smooth, uncracked. She wrote that down too. The basement stairs were in the corner of the kitchen, behind a door that had swollen in its frame and required Hector to put his shoulder to it to get open. He went first, testing each step before putting his weight on it. She followed. The basement was large, larger than she'd expected, running nearly the full footprint of the house. The floor was dirt, hard-packed and dry. The walls were the same stone as the foundation she'd seen outside, and down here, in the beam of Hector's flashlight, she could see the craftsmanship in it more clearly, courses laid with real precision, joints tight, no significant separation. There was a coal furnace in one corner that had been converted, badly, to oil at some point and then abandoned when the oil tank was removed. There were wooden shelving units along two walls, rough-built but sturdy, the kind of thing someone had made to be useful rather than decorative. And there was something else. On the far wall of the basement, in the northeast corner, the stone gave way to a section of older material. She noticed it because the color was different, darker, and the joints between the stones were different too. The mortar older, grayer, almost sandy-looking compared to the more uniform mortar of the rest of the basement wall. She walked toward it. Hector followed her. "This wall," she said, "it's different." He shone the flashlight on it. "Different stone," he agreed. "Older, maybe." She reached out and pressed her palm against it. The stone was cool and slightly damp. No, not damp. Cool but dry. There was no moisture bloom on it. No salt crystallization from water migration. Just cool. She tapped on it with her knuckle. Hector tapped beside her. They both heard it. The sound wasn't wrong, exactly. It wasn't hollow in any dramatic sense. But it was different from the other sections of wall they'd tapped on. A faint resonance behind the stone, as though the wall was backed by air rather than soil. "That's probably just an old cistern," Hector said. "Farmhouses this age, a lot of them had cisterns for rainwater collection. You'd build it against the foundation wall to keep it cool." She kept her palm against the stone for a moment longer. "Probably," she said. They went back upstairs. On the way out, Hector stopped in the doorway of the main room and looked around. "If you want my honest read on this," he said, "please. The roof needs work on the north end. You got a bad bathroom floor, a kitchen ceiling that needs to come down and be redone, windows throughout that need at minimum new glazing and probably new sashes. The porch is about a third good lumber and the rest is compost." He paused. "But the structure is sound. The sill plates are solid where I could check them. The framing in the walls I could see is tight. That foundation is quality work that stood for a long time and will stand more." He looked at her. $12,000 for the property, plus maybe $40,000 in work if you're getting contractors to do it, or 15 to 20 if you're getting your hands dirty and trading labor for skill. She did the math without moving her face. "You know people?" she asked. "Who'd work a trade?" He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said. "I know people who respect someone willing to work." When she made the offer the following week, she had $780 in combined savings and a payment plan request, the boldest thing she'd done with money since marrying Marco. The county land office, after an interminable 10 days during which she did not tell anyone what she'd done, called to say the arrangement had been approved. She would need $500 as an initial payment and could pay the remaining $7,500 over 24 months at no interest, the county's standard terms for their land transfer program for owner-occupant buyers. She drove to the bank and made the payment that afternoon. Then she sat in the parking lot and cried for about 4 minutes, which she allowed herself because she'd been holding it since Marco died. Then she drove to Donna's house and started looking up YouTube videos on how to replace porch boards. Donna found her at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock that night with the laptop and a cup of cold coffee and a notebook full of measurements she'd taken during the visit. "You actually did it," Donna said. She did not sound appalled. She sounded something more complicated than that. "I did it," Teresa said. Donna sat down across from her. She looked at the notebook, at the list of things that needed to be done, the numbers Teresa had written down and crossed out and rewritten. Her sister was 5 years older and had made practical, sensible choices her entire adult life, and Teresa had always loved her for it, and sometimes found it suffocating in the way that sensible choices could be when you needed something else. "You know Mom and Dale are going to think this is crazy," Donna said. "I know. Greta's going to call again." "I know." Donna looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you need?" Teresa let out a breath she'd been holding for 2 days. "Help," she said. "I need a lot of help." The first thing she did was the roof. Not because it was the most urgent thing structurally. Hector had explained that the section over the north end was damaged, but the water damage hadn't yet compromised the framing. She had a window of a few months before that changed, but because the roof was what everything else depended on. You couldn't fix the kitchen ceiling until you'd stopped the water getting in. You couldn't properly assess what needed to happen to the walls until the moisture cycle stopped. Fix the roof first, and you stopped the bleeding. She moved into the farmhouse in early December, which was, by any rational assessment, too soon. The heat didn't work. The bathroom floor was plywood laid over the hole where the soft boards had been pulled up, because the subfloor repair was still 2 weeks from happening. The kitchen ceiling was down to the joist in the north half because she'd pulled the damaged plaster herself after watching 3 separate videos on how to do it, and the exposed framing above looked fine, exactly as Hector had said it would, but it also meant she was cooking under bare wooden beams with plastic sheeting stapled across the gap where the plaster had been. Marisol thought this was extraordinary. She had named the kitchen the cave and drew a picture of it for school that her teacher had called imaginative and that Teresa had taped to the refrigerator. She moved them in because the farmhouse was hers, and because every night she spent at Donna's house was a night she was aware of her sister's tolerance and her brother-in-law's patience and the careful way everyone navigated around the reality that she was 31 years old with a child and no husband, and now a broken house and a debt to the county and another debt to a medical collection agency. She moved in because waking up inside a problem felt better than waking up outside it. They slept in sleeping bags for the first 2 weeks, on the inflatable mattress she'd bought at a discount store, in the room that was in the best shape structurally, the southeast corner bedroom upstairs, which had intact plaster and a window that actually closed all the way. She'd run a space heater from the outlet that Hector had tested and confirmed was on a working circuit. It was cold enough that she could see her breath in the mornings, but not unbearably so, and Marisol treated it as an adventure with a thoroughness that made Teresa love her in a way that was almost painful. The town of Clement had a population of about 4,000 people. It had a Dollar General, a pharmacy, a bar called The Anchor, and a Facebook group that was mostly used to complain about the speed limit on Route 9 and to sell furniture. Within a week of Teresa's arrival, the fact that someone had bought the Sycamore Gap Road property was known to most of the people in Clement who cared about such things, which was more of them than she'd expected. Some of them drove past slowly, which she noticed from the window. A woman named Barb, who ran the feed store and who had a voice like a foghorn and an apparent interest in all things local, stopped Teresa in the parking lot of the pharmacy and asked if she was the one who'd bought the Hargrove place. Teresa said she guessed she was, not knowing that was what it had been called. Barb looked her up and down in the way of someone taking inventory and said, "That place has been an eyesore since old Roland died. What you going to do with it?" "Live in it," Teresa said. Barb had stared at her. "Just you and your little girl?" "Just us." Barb had made a sound that was not quite skepticism and not quite admiration. She said. The person most committed to voicing what others were merely thinking was Dale, her brother-in-law, who drove out to the farmhouse on a Saturday morning in early December with 2 coffees in a cardboard carrier and a face full of things he had been saving up. He stood in the kitchen under the exposed joists and the plastic sheeting and drank his coffee and said things like, This is going to cost you more than you think. And do you have any idea what permits alone run these days? And Donna worries, which was how Dale expressed his own concern by outsourcing it to Donna. She listened, because he was not entirely wrong, and because the coffees were good. When he was done, she said, I know it's not smart. I know I can't do this the way someone with money would. But I own this. I actually own this. And I'm going to make it work. Dale had looked at her for a while. Then he finished his coffee and said, You want help with that porch this weekend? I've got a chainsaw. She had said yes. The porch had gotten started that Sunday. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. By February, she had the roof repaired, the kitchen ceiling replastered and painted, the bathroom floor properly rebuilt, and 3 of the 8 porch boards replaced. The house was not warm in any comfortable sense, but the pipes hadn't frozen, which Hector had been worried about, and the space heaters she distributed strategically throughout the main living areas kept the temperature above 45 degrees even on the worst nights, which she decided counted as a win. Her hands had changed. That was the thing she noticed most. She was a person who had done bookkeeping for most of her working life, who had spent years at a keyboard and a 10 key, and now her hands were roughened, with new calluses across the palms and a particular toughness to the fingertips that came from handling cold tools in cold air. She found this satisfying in a way she hadn't expected. Marisol had started 2nd grade at Clement Elementary in January, which was 2 months after her classmates, a fact that Teresa had worried about, and which Marisol had handled with a social confidence that Teresa was genuinely unsure where she'd inherited. By February, Marisol had a best friend named Juniper and had been invited to 2 birthday parties and had reported with some satisfaction that her classroom had a hamster named Biscuit. The farmhouse was becoming a home. Not a finished one, not a comfortable one by most standards, but a home in the sense that it was theirs, and they were changing it, and it was changing them. And on the evenings when Marisol did her homework at the kitchen table, while Teresa worked on her bookkeeping clients at the other end, the house felt not like a project, but like a life. The basement had been, in the practical hierarchy of repairs, last. The roof, the bathroom, the kitchen ceiling, the porch, the windows in the worst shape, all of those had to come first because they were the things that were actively getting worse. The basement was bad but stable. The coal-to-oil furnace situation meant there was no working heat source down there, which was a project for spring. The shelving units were sturdy but not useful to her yet. She had gone down there perhaps a dozen times since moving in, mostly to check the sump situation after heavy rain. And each time she had registered the section of different stone in the northeast corner without doing anything about it. It was just there, the same cool, faintly resonant wall, the older mortar, the slightly different color. She had looked up old cisterns twice on her phone, and both times confirmed that yes, farmhouses of this age commonly had them, and that they were usually not dangerous but could occasionally be a source of moisture if they weren't properly sealed. One evening in late March, she went down there with a better flashlight. She was not going for the wall specifically. She'd gone down to check whether the floor in the southeast corner had dried out after a wet week. The sump had been running more than she liked, and she wanted to see if there was standing water anywhere. She did the sump check, confirmed the floor was fine, and was turning to go back up the stairs when the flashlight beam caught the wall in the northeast corner at a different angle than she'd seen it before. She stopped. The light was raking across the stone at a low angle now, the beam nearly parallel to the wall surface, and in that light, she could see something she hadn't noticed before. Not in the stone itself. In the floor in front of it. There was a seam. It was subtle, barely visible, a line in the hard-packed dirt floor that ran parallel to the wall and then turned at a right angle about 4 feet out, forming, if you traced it with your eye, a rectangle. The line wasn't deep. It was more of a slight compression, a linear variation in the surface that you could only see if the light hit it exactly right. She walked to it slowly and crouched. The line was real. She ran her finger along it and felt the edge, a definite edge in the soil, as though something had been cut here and then settled over decades until the cut was almost invisible, but not quite. She walked the perimeter of the rectangle, which was roughly 5 feet by 3 feet, and it held consistent throughout. Definite edges. A door, or a hatch, or a covering. Something that had been here long enough for the soil around it to pack and partially obscure it, but not long enough to erase it entirely. She went back upstairs and got a garden trowel from the toolbox on the porch. She spent the next hour on her knees in the northeast corner of the basement, carefully clearing the packed soil away from the seam. The work was slow because she was trying not to damage whatever was beneath. The dirt was hard, compressed by years and footsteps, and it came away in small increments, falling to the side in clods. Gradually the seam became more defined, and then the edges of what was beneath began to show. It was wood, not modern lumber. Old wood, dense and dark with age, its surface cut smooth. As she cleared more soil, she found a surface the texture of the wood had a particular tightness to it. The grain compressed, the kind of wood that got harder rather than softer with age. She uncovered the corners first, then the sides, until she had the full perimeter of what was clearly a hatch, perhaps 2 inches thick, fitted precisely into a frame cut into the floor. The frame itself was set into a concrete collar, smooth concrete unlike anything else in the basement floor, poured carefully around the hatch as a seal. There was no handle. There was a fitting on one side, recessed, where a handle had been removed or had corroded away. She fit her fingers into the fitting and pulled. It did not move. Not locked, she thought, but stuck. Years of the concrete collar settling, of moisture cycling, of the hatch and its frame becoming one continuous thing. She went back upstairs again and came back with a flat pry bar from the toolbox. She worked the pry bar into the seam between the hatch and the frame carefully, trying to feel for the point of resistance. She found it on the second try, a suction point on the near edge where the fit was tightest, and she leaned on the pry bar with steady pressure, not a sudden force but a sustained one. The hatch moved. It was an inch at first, then 2, the old wood shifting in its frame with a sound like a long exhale. Cold air came up through the gap, noticeably cooler than the basement itself, dry and still, carrying a smell she could not immediately name. Not rot, not mold. Something older than both of those, something mineral and papery and still. She pried the hatch fully open and let it fall back against the floor. A wooden ladder was fixed to the wall of the shaft below, its rungs set into iron brackets. She shone the flashlight down. The shaft was about 8 feet deep, its walls dry stone, and at the bottom she could see a floor. A real floor, not dirt, something flat and pale that reflected the flashlight. Beam. She called Marisol's name up the basement stairs. Marisol appeared at the top. "Can you do me a favor?" Teresa said. "Can you go next door to Hector's and ask him to come over for a few minutes?" Marisol looked at her mother, then at the hole in the floor. "What's that?" she said. "I'm not sure yet," Teresa said. "Can I look?" "Not yet. Go get Hector." Hector came over in about 10 minutes, still in his work clothes. He stood at the edge of the hatch and shone his own flashlight down. His expression was the same controlled one he used when he was forming an opinion. "Old," he said. "Very old. You going down?" "I was going to wait for you." He tested the ladder with one hand, then both, then climbed down the first 3 rungs and back up. "Solid," he said. "Let's go." They went down. Marisol stood at the top of the hatch and watched them. The space at the bottom of the shaft was larger than the shaft itself, opening out to the left and right. The ceiling was about 7 feet high. The walls were the same cut stone as the section she'd noticed upstairs, the old stone, the darker stone with the sandy mortar. The floor was paved with flat field stones fitted together closely, and it was dry. The air was cooler than the basement above, but not cold, and it was extraordinarily still. She stood and let the flashlight travel. The space extended further than she'd initially thought. It was a room, a full room, at least 20 feet in each direction. Along the far wall there were wooden shelving units, old ones, built into the stone with iron brackets. On the shelves were boxes. Not cardboard boxes, wooden boxes, crated things, the kind of crating used for transport or long-term storage. There were perhaps 30 of them. She counted quickly, maybe more. And beside the shelving, on a low workbench of the same heavy old wood as the hatch, there were tools. Conservation tools, though she didn't know that word yet. Small brushes. Soft cloths folded neatly. Shallow trays. A set of measuring instruments in a leather roll, arranged with the care of someone who used them regularly, who respected what they were for. She crossed the room. Her footsteps on the stone floor were very quiet. She reached the nearest crate on the shelf, a wooden box about the size of a small suitcase, sealed with a wooden latch. She undid the latch and opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in fabric that had gone from white to ivory over a very long time, was a painting. She could see only a portion of it, the corner of the wrapped thing, but where the fabric had shifted slightly with the opening of the crate, she could see the edge of the frame. It was old wood, gilded, the gilt worn to a warmth rather than a shine. And below the frame, she could see the surface of the painting itself, the unmistakable texture of old oil on canvas, layers of pigment that had dried over a very long time into something that was not flat and not smooth, but alive with the depth of accumulated decisions. She closed the crate carefully. She stood with her hands on the wood for a moment, not moving. Hector was behind her. She could hear him breathing. She turned around. "What is this place?" she said. He shook his head slowly. He was looking around the room with the expression she'd never seen on him before. Something close to awe. She reached into her pocket for her phone and opened the flashlight to full brightness. She walked along the shelving, looking at the crates, counting them. 31, 32. She looked at the markings on the sides of some of them, numbers and symbols penciled in faded ink, inventory marks of some kind. She found one crate that had been partially opened, its latch loose, and she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in the same ivory fabric, was a book. Not a modern book. A volume. The word came to her from nowhere, heavy and old, its cover boards visible at the corner where the wrapping had shifted. She could see the spine, the faint impression of a title in a language she did not read. She closed that crate too. She stood in the middle of the room and looked up at the stone ceiling 7 feet above her, and then down at the fieldstone floor, and then at the shelves with their 32 crates and the workbench with its careful tools. She had spent $500 on a rotting farmhouse and found this beneath it. The person who built this room had done so with intention. That was the thing she kept returning to as she stood there in the cold, still air. The stonework was precise. The floor was fitted. The shelving was built in, permanent, not just placed. The workbench was of a piece with the room. This was not a root cellar, not a storage space added as an afterthought. This was purpose-built. Someone had designed this room for exactly what was in it and had meant for it to last. She thought about the hatch, the way it had been fitted to its concrete collar, the way the dirt above it had been carefully packed. Someone had sealed this room and covered the evidence of sealing and then let the farmhouse above it fall into whoever's hands it fell into. The question was why. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Marisol, texting from upstairs with one of Donna's old phones they used as a house communicator. "Mom, are you okay?" She typed back, "Yes. Give me 5 more minutes. I'm okay." Hector was standing near the shelves looking at the crates. He had not touched any of them. He understood without being told that touching them required some decision she hadn't made yet. "What do I do?" she said. He turned. "It's your house," he said. "It's your property. Whatever's here, it belongs to you. I don't know what it is." He nodded. "Then you find out." Before she left the room that first night, she did one more thing. She walked to the workbench and looked more carefully at what was laid out on it. The brushes were made from real hair, natural fibers, the kind of brushes that cost money. The shallow trays had faint residue in them, dried traces of something she couldn't identify, slightly waxy, slightly crystalline at the edges. The measuring instruments in the leather roll included things she recognized and things she didn't. A micrometer, something that looked like a humidity gauge, old and brass-fitted. A magnifying lens in a brass housing that folded flat for storage. Someone had been working down here. Not recently. The tools had dust on them. A fine, even coating that suggested years of stillness. But someone had worked here regularly enough to organize the tools with the habit of someone who used them, who knew exactly where each thing was and put it back. She picked up the leather roll and looked at the inside of the flap. There was writing there, faint pencil, the kind of thing someone would write for their own reference and not for anyone else. A name, possibly, though she couldn't fully read it in the flashlight. And a date, clearer than the name, 1943. She set the roll down and stood very still. The farmhouse had been standing since before that. The basement walls were older than that. But someone had been down here in 1943, working with these tools, writing their name on the inside of a leather instrument roll as though they expected to come back for it. They had not come back. Or if they had not taken the tools. She left the room. She climbed the ladder, emerged into the basement, and closed the hatch behind her, settling it back into its frame. She didn't pack the soil back over it. She just left it closed and sat on the basement floor with her flashlight pointed at the ceiling and breathed. It took her a while to go back upstairs. Not because she was frightened, because she needed to sit with the weight of it before she carried it anywhere else. She called her sister Donna that evening after Marisol was in bed. She described the room, the ladder, the crates, the tools on the workbench, the corner of the painting she'd seen. She described the book with its old cover boards and its faded title in a language she didn't know. She described the leather roll and the date on the inside of the flap. Donna was quiet for a long time. "You need to call someone," Donna said finally. "A lawyer. Or an appraiser. Someone who knows what they're looking at." "I know. Teresa." "I know, Donna. This is serious." "I know it's serious. This might be more serious than you know." Teresa looked at the wall of her kitchen, at the replastered ceiling she had done herself, at the window she'd reglazed with a YouTube tutorial and a lot of patience. "I know," she said again. "But whatever it is, it's here. It's in my house. Under my floor." There was a long pause. Then Donna said, quietly, "You knew, didn't you? When you bought that place. Something in you knew." Teresa thought about sitting outside the farmhouse in November with the car running and Marisol asleep in the back, and the listing in her pocket, and the feeling that was not hope, but was something quieter and more stubborn. "I knew the bones were good," she said. She slept badly and woke at 4:30 with the particular alertness of someone whose mind had been working through the night without permission. The house was quiet and cold. She lay in the dark and thought about the room below the basement, about the 32 crates on their shelves, about the tools on the workbench and the date penciled on the inside of the leather roll. She knew enough history to know why that year mattered. Not all of what happened in 1943, not in any scholarly sense, but the broad shape of it. The world had been at war. Europe had been at war. There had been. She'd read this somewhere in the haphazard way she'd read a lot of things, a systematic effort in the years before and during the war to move art. To protect it. To hide it. The Nazis had looted collections across the continent. Museums had evacuated their holdings to country houses and caves and salt mines. Private collectors had dispersed their possessions through channels both official and not, trusting strangers with paintings that had been in families for generations, on the theory that survival in obscurity was better than destruction in place. She was not a historian. She was a bookkeeper in a half-repaired farmhouse in Garfield County, and she was lying in the dark thinking about a date on a piece of leather in a room under her floor. She got up at 5 and made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. She searched for wartime art preservation, for art hidden during World War II, for collections evacuated from Europe, for the kinds of things that got hidden and never found. She read for 2 hours, following links from article to article, from databases to museum records to newspaper stories about discoveries, some recent, some decades old. She read about repositories in the Austrian Alps, about hidden caches in French farmhouses, about collections that had been packed in crates by families who had minutes to act and had never come back to retrieve them. She read about the people who had done the hiding. Not always wealthy people. Not always famous collectors. Sometimes ordinary people, neighbors, farmers, people who had agreed to take in a crate or a wrapped canvas or a wooden box and keep it in a cellar or a hayloft because someone had asked them to, because refusing seemed worse than the risk. She thought about the farmhouse, about whoever had owned it in 1943, about whether a family in rural Garfield County might have received something that needed keeping, about whether a sealed room beneath a farmhouse might have been exactly the right place to put something that needed to survive a war. It was a long stretch of logic. She knew that. The probability that 32 crates in a farmhouse basement represented a wartime art cache rather than an eccentric local collector's forgotten storage was, by any reasonable measure, low. Probably the room held something mundane. Old furniture. Family documents. Something a previous owner had put there and never retrieved because people's lives ended and the things they'd stored outlasted them. But the tools on the workbench. The conservation tools. The humidity gauge. Those were not the tools of someone storing furniture. She had been up for 3 hours when Marisol appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair at an angle that suggested she had been sleeping on her face. "You didn't sleep," Marisol said. "I slept some. You've got your thinking face." Teresa looked at her. "I've got a face for thinking? It's when your forehead goes like this." Marisol scrunched her forehead into an exaggerated furrow. Teresa laughed, which she hadn't expected to do. "Come here." Marisol came and climbed onto the chair beside her and leaned against her shoulder the way she'd done since she was very small. Teresa put an arm around her, and they sat like that for a moment while the coffee cooled. "Is it the room?" Marisol asked. "Yes." "Are we going to go back down?" "Yes. But not yet. First I have to find someone who knows what they're looking at." "Is it treasure?" Teresa looked at her laptop screen, at the article open on it about wartime art repositories. She thought about the gilded frame she'd seen in the first crate, the worn warmth of it, the particular depth of the paint surface visible at the corner of the wrapping. "I think it might be something more important than treasure," she said. Marisol thought about this. "More important than treasure," she repeated, as though testing the concept. "Yes." Marisol leaned further into her shoulder. "Okay," she said, with the equanimity of a 7-year-old who had already adapted to sleeping in a sleeping bag in a house without functioning heat and now apparently was prepared to adapt to whatever this turned out to be. After Marisol left for school on the bus that came to the end of the driveway, Teresa spent another hour on the phone. She called the county land office to confirm, which she should have done the night before, but hadn't thought clearly enough to do, that any structures or storage discovered on the property were indeed included in her ownership. The woman she spoke to was patient and thorough and confirmed that yes, the property transfer included all structures and contents therein, that this was standard language in the county land transfer program agreements, and that any pre-existing contents would be considered part of the property as transferred unless they could be claimed by a named individual with documented ownership, which after 11 years of the property sitting in county possession was unlikely to be anyone. She thanked the woman and ended the call and sat for a moment with the legal clarity of it settling over her. Then she went downstairs and opened the hatch and went back into the room. In the morning light coming through the basement windows, filtered and dim but real, the room felt different than it had the night before with flashlights. Less otherworldly, more actual. She stood at the bottom of the ladder and let her eyes adjust, and then she walked the perimeter slowly, touching nothing. The crates on the shelving were not all the same size. She counted again, 34. She'd undercounted the night before. Some were the size of a suitcase, the one she'd opened. Others were larger, the dimensions of something meant to hold a canvas rolled around a tube. A few were small, the size of a shoebox or a large book, which was maybe exactly what they held. She found what she'd missed the night before. On the wall to the left of the shelving, there was a wooden cabinet, narrow and tall, built flush with the stone wall in the same way the shelving was built. It had 2 doors, held closed with a simple wooden turn latch. She opened it. Inside were documents. Not crates of documents, not boxes. Stacks of paper and folded sheets, some loose, some gathered in folders made of a heavier paper stock than modern folders, a stiffer material, slightly yellowed. She did not touch them. She looked at them. On the top of the nearest stack was a sheet in a language she could partially read. She'd had 2 years of high school French, which had mostly left her with the ability to read menus and recognize words that looked like their English cognates. This document had some of those words. She could see something that looked like a number, a large number, and a date, and what she was almost certain was the word for paintings. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went upstairs, poured the rest of the cold coffee down the sink, and started looking for a phone number. The Association for the Preservation of Historical Art and Documents had a website that was clean and functional, and that listed, in the About section, several things relevant to her situation. It mentioned wartime provenance research specifically. It mentioned collaboration with international organizations that track displaced art from the Second World War. It mentioned, in language that was carefully neutral, that their services were available to property owners who had discovered art or cultural artifacts of potentially significant age or provenance. Potentially significant age or provenance. She read that twice. Then she called the number. The next morning, she called a number she'd found online after 2 hours of searching. The Association for the Preservation of Historical Art and Documents. A woman named Celeste answered. Teresa said, "I bought a farmhouse and I found a room under it, and there are crates of old paintings and books in it, and I don't know who put them there or how old they are or what they're worth. But I think someone put them there on purpose, and I think they've been there for a long time." There was a brief silence. Then Celeste said, "Where are you?" "Clement," Teresa said. "In Garfield County. Can you be available tomorrow?" Teresa looked at her kitchen ceiling, at the replastered surface that had taken her 2 weeks and 2 tutorials, and 1 complete redo to get right. Yes, she said. I can be available tomorrow. Celeste arrived the next afternoon in a silver sedan that had seen better decades, accompanied by a man she introduced as Dr. Philip Marsh, who carried a canvas bag that clinked faintly when he set it down, and who looked at the farmhouse with the expression of someone who had seen a great many things in a great many states of repair and had learned not to lead with conclusions. Celeste herself was perhaps 55, with gray-streaked hair pulled back efficiently and the kind of unhurried manner that came from spending years in rooms where patience was not optional. She shook Teresa's hand with a firm grip and looked her directly in the eye and said, "You described this very clearly on the phone. That's useful. Most people don't." Teresa showed them into the kitchen and offered coffee, which they both accepted. Marisol was at school. The house smelled of plaster dust and the wood stain she'd been applying to the repaired porch boards the evening before. Celeste looked around the kitchen with a calm, taking stock attention, and Teresa had the feeling of being assessed without being judged, which was different from most of the assessments she'd experienced lately. She told them the full story, from the listing on the laundromat board to the hatch to the room. Celeste asked questions that were specific and practical. How deep below the basement floor was the hatch? What were the dimensions of the room as best she could estimate? Had she touched any of the contents of the crates beyond the 2 she'd opened? Had she noticed any moisture on the walls or floor? What was the temperature differential between the room and the basement above it? Dr. Marsh listened without speaking, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, his eyes on the table in front of him in the way of someone concentrating rather than disengaged. When she finished, Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The conservation tools are significant." "I thought so," Teresa said. "I didn't know why exactly. Because they suggest whoever used this room understood what they were preserving. Not just that they had valuable things, but that those things required specific care. Temperature regulation, controlled humidity, the right materials for cleaning and handling. That's a different category of person than someone who just buried their valuables." Dr. Marsh looked up. "The date on the instrument roll. You're certain it was 1943? "I'm certain of the last 2 digits, Teresa said. "The 4 and the 3. The first 2 were harder to read, but the shape looked right for 19. He nodded slowly. He looked at Celeste. "Can we see it?" Celeste said. They went down through the kitchen, through the basement, and down the ladder. Teresa went first to hold the flashlight. Dr. Marsh went second, moving carefully on the rungs, and Celeste last. When they were all standing on the fieldstone floor of the room, Teresa raised the flashlight and swept it across the space, and she watched their faces. Dr. Marsh made a sound she couldn't fully categorize. It was not quite a word. His hands moved to his canvas bag, and he unzipped it and took out a compact LED work light, which he set on the floor and switched on. The room filled with clean white light. Celeste walked to the shelving and stood in front of the crates without touching them. She was reading the markings on the sides, the numbers and symbols penciled in faded ink. Her expression did not change, but her stillness deepened, the particular stillness of someone whose mind was moving very fast behind a composed face. Dr. Marsh had gone to the workbench. He was looking at the tools without touching them, leaning close, his hands behind his back like a museum visitor following the rules. "These brushes," he said quietly, "are squirrel hair. Good quality. Pre-war manufacture, based on the handle construction. And this." He leaned closer to the shallow trays. "The residue in the trays, you said it was waxy?" "Slightly. And crystalline at the edges. That's consistent with a consolidant. A conservation material used to stabilize flaking paint. You wouldn't use that on furniture or documents. You'd use it on paintings. Specifically on paintings with unstable paint layers that need to be secured before transport." Teresa looked at the trays. "Someone was treating paintings here," she said. "Someone was treating paintings here," he agreed. Celeste turned from the shelving. She had put on a pair of nitrile gloves from her own bag. She reached for the nearest crate, the one Teresa had already opened, and undid the latch. She lifted the lid with both hands and set it aside. Then she carefully, with movements that had a deliberateness that Teresa found almost ceremonial, unfolded the wrapping from the corner where Teresa had seen the frame. The painting emerged slowly, the gilded frame first, then the painted surface. Celeste lifted it with both hands flat beneath the frame and turned it to the light. It was a portrait. A woman, seated, in clothing that was clearly old, the kind of formal dress that put the subject in a specific century without Teresa being able to say which one exactly. The background was dark, warm, the figure emerging from it with a quality of light that made her seem present in the room in a way that a photograph wouldn't have. Her expression was composed and attentive, the expression of someone who had agreed to sit still for a long time and was doing it with dignity. The paint surface was in extraordinary condition. Even to Teresa's untrained eye, the colors were not faded. The brushwork was visible, the individual decisions of the painter still readable in the surface, the way a stroke had been loaded and then dragged across the canvas to create a certain quality of fabric or skin. Dr. Marsh came to stand beside Celeste. He was very quiet. "Look at the craquelure," he said. Celeste nodded. The surface of the paint had a network of fine cracks, visible when the light caught it at an angle, the kind of aging pattern that developed over centuries. Not the wide, irregular cracking of a neglected painting, not the damage of climate fluctuation. The fine, even pattern of a painting that had been very old and very well cared for. "How old?" Teresa asked. Celeste looked at the back of the canvas, tilting the painting carefully. "The stretcher bars," she said, "are consistent with 17th century construction. The canvas." She examined the edge where it wrapped around the bar. "The weave. This needs proper analysis to confirm, but based on what I'm seeing here, this painting is at minimum 300 years old. Possibly older." Teresa sat down on the bottom rung of the ladder. "Let's look at another," Celeste said. They opened 4 more crates over the next hour. A landscape, dark trees against a pale sky, the handling of light so specific and controlled it seemed almost impossible. A small panel painting, wood rather than canvas, the surface dense with pigment applied in a way that bore no resemblance to anything Teresa had seen in a gallery on the one occasion she'd been to a museum, in a school trip at 13. 2 more portraits, different hands, different periods, one much older than the others, the gold background and flattened forms of something that preceded the Renaissance. Between each opening they paused. Celeste made notes in a small notebook. Dr. Marsh photographed everything, the crates, the markings, the paintings themselves, the tools. He was systematic and thorough, and he did not rush. After the 5th crate was resealed and returned to the shelf, Celeste looked at Teresa. "I need to be honest with you about what I'm seeing," she said, "because you asked me here to do exactly that. Please, what's in these crates is significant. I can't tell you specific attributions without proper analysis, without examination under controlled conditions and technical imaging. What I can tell you is that the quality of these works, their condition, their apparent age, and the manner in which they've been stored, everything about this suggests a collection assembled with serious knowledge and resources. Not random acquisitions. Not a local farmer's accumulated curiosity. These were chosen by someone who knew what they were choosing." Teresa was quiet. "The markings on the crates," Celeste continued, "are consistent with a cataloging system. European, I believe, based on the notation style. Someone numbered these systematically, which means there's likely a corresponding inventory somewhere. A list of what each crate contains." "The cabinet," Teresa said. "Yes, the documents in the cabinet. I haven't looked at those yet, but if there's an inventory here, that's where it would be." Dr. Marsh had returned to the workbench and was looking at the humidity gauge with his magnifying lens. He said, without turning around, "The date on this roll is 1943. The conservant residue in the trays is consistent with materials available in the 1930s and 40s. The crating technique, the way the paintings are wrapped, the padding material, these are consistent with evacuation packing. The kind of packing done under time pressure, by people who knew what they were doing but didn't have unlimited time to do it." "Evacuation from where?" Teresa said. He turned. "That's the question," he said. Celeste opened the cabinet and stood before the stacked documents. She did not touch them yet. She was reading what she could from the edges and surfaces visible to her. After a moment she said, "May I?" "Please," Teresa said. Celeste took the top folder and opened it on the workbench beside Dr. Marsh's light. The pages inside were dense with typed text and handwritten annotations, the paper heavy and slightly yellowed, the ink still dark. She read for perhaps 2 minutes without speaking. Then she set the folder down and looked at Teresa. "This is an inventory," she said. "A detailed inventory. Item numbers corresponding to the crate markings. Descriptions. Dimensions. Attribution notes. Can you read the language? Some of it. Celeste's expression was controlled, but not entirely. Her jaw had the tightness of someone managing a strong reaction. The primary text is in French. There are annotations in German. And there are dates throughout, ranging from 1938 to 1943. 1938 to 1943, Teresa repeated. Yes. Dr. Marsh had picked up the next folder in the cabinet and was looking at it. He said, quietly, "This is correspondence." He turned a page. "There are names here." He looked at Celeste. "There are names I recognize." Celeste nodded. Teresa looked from one of them to the other. She said, "Can one of you tell me what you think this is?" "Plainly." Celeste and Dr. Marsh exchanged a look. Then Celeste said, "Plainly. Based on what I'm seeing, this room contains a collection of artworks that were brought to this location during the Second World War. The inventory dates, the packing materials, the conservation tools, the correspondence, all of it is consistent with a wartime dispersal, the kind undertaken by private collectors or institutions to protect holdings from Nazi confiscation or the general destruction of the war." She paused. "If the attributions in this inventory are accurate, and I cannot confirm that without proper analysis, the collection in this room includes works by artists of major historical significance." "What artists?" Teresa said. Celeste looked at the inventory folder. She said a name, then another, then a third one that Teresa didn't recognize immediately, but which she could tell from the way Dr. Marsh's expression shifted was significant. She sat on the ladder rung again. "What is this worth?" she said. Celeste looked at her directly. "I can't give you a number today. What I can tell you is that each of the 5 works we've examined would be, individually, a significant discovery. Together, as a collection, with the provenance documentation potentially intact in this cabinet, this is not a number I want to say out loud in this room without more information." Teresa looked around the room. At the 34 crates on their shelves. At the cabinet of documents. At the workbench with its careful tools and the leather roll with its penciled date. She thought about $500 and a payment arrangement with the county. She thought about sleeping bags and space heaters and the way Marisol had named the cave kitchen with the plastic sheeting over the bare joists and drawn it for school. She thought about Greta's voice saying Marco would be horrified. About Dale's red pen circles on job listings left on the kitchen table. About the careful way people had been looking at her. She breathed in slowly and breathed out. "Okay," she said. "What do we do now?" Celeste closed the folder. "Now," she said, "we do this correctly." Doing it correctly took longer than Teresa had any framework for. The first step was securing the room, which meant not going back into it except with Celeste or Dr. Marsh present, and telling no one beyond the people who already knew, which at this point was Hector, Donna, and now these 2. This was harder than it sounded, not because Teresa was tempted to talk, but because Clement was a small town and Celeste and Dr. Marsh's silver sedan parked in her driveway twice in 1 week had already been noticed. Barb from the feed store had driven by twice with a slowing down quality that Teresa recognized as active curiosity. The second step was the documentation. Over 3 visits across 2 weeks, Celeste and Dr. Marsh worked through the room systematically. Every crate was photographed externally, the markings recorded, the position on the shelving noted. The cabinet documents were removed 1 folder at a time, photographed, replaced. Nothing was taken from the room. Everything was documented in place. Dr. Marsh brought equipment on the second visit, a device that measured temperature and humidity at multiple points in the room, logging the readings on an interval. The readings were, he reported with a satisfaction that suggested he'd half expected otherwise, remarkably stable. The room maintained a temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit and a relative humidity of 48%, conditions that were, by any conservation standard, excellent for the long-term preservation of both paintings and paper. "Whoever designed this room," he said to Teresa on the afternoon of the second visit, while she sat on the ladder rung watching him work, understood conservation science at a level that was not common in the 1940s. The depth below grade, the stone mass of the walls, the sealed hatch, all of it acts as a passive climate system. The temperature and humidity are buffered by the earth itself. There's no active climate control, and it doesn't need any. He looked around with an expression she'd come to recognize as the professional version of what Marisol had looked like at Christmas the year before. "They built this to last," he said. On the third visit, Celeste sat down with Teresa at the kitchen table after they'd come back up from the room and spread out printed copies of the document photographs. The translations she'd had done in the intervening days were clipped to the originals, the handwriting of a translator she'd contacted in New York rendering the French into clean English. The inventory is for 61 items, Celeste said. 34 crates. Several crates hold more than one work. Mostly paintings, but also drawings, 2 illuminated manuscripts, and a collection of correspondence and documents that appear to have personal and historical significance of their own. Teresa looked at the printed inventory. She could see the item numbers now, the descriptions in translation, the attribution notes. Names she partially recognized from art history classes she'd taken in community college, names she'd encountered in the articles she'd been reading since the discovery. The correspondence, Celeste continued, is between a man named Wilhelm Brenner, a German Jewish art dealer based in Paris, and various contacts in France, Switzerland, and the United States. The letters run from 1938 to 1943. They document Brenner's efforts to evacuate his inventory as the situation in Europe deteriorated. He was, based on these letters, a man of considerable knowledge and considerable connections. He arranged the dispersal of his collection through multiple channels, sending different portions to different locations to reduce the risk of total loss. What happened to him? Teresa asked. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Based on the correspondence, which ends in the fall of 1943, he was in Paris as of September of that year. The last letter in the file is addressed to a man named Robert Hargrove. Teresa went still. The previous owner of this property was named Roland Hargrove, she said. Yes, Celeste said. We know. Robert Hargrove would have been Roland Hargrove's father or possibly grandfather, depending on the years. The last letter from Brenner to Hargrove thanks him, in language that is formal but carries what I can only read as genuine feeling, for his agreement to receive and protect a portion of the collection. Brenner writes that he has no way to know when he will be in a position to retrieve it, and asks only that Hargrove keep it safe and intact until such time as Brenner or his designated representative can make arrangements. Teresa looked at the letter, at the translation clipped to it. The last paragraph, in the translator's clean rendering. I ask only this of you, that you keep these things as you would keep a promise to someone you have never met. They represent not only what I have built, but what survived. Keep them safe. I will come when I can. He didn't come, Teresa said. No, Celeste said. He didn't. Do you know what happened to him? We're working on that. There are organizations that specialize in tracing the fate of Jewish art dealers and collectors during the war. We've reached out to 2 of them. We should know more within a few weeks. Teresa looked at the letter for a long time. She thought about a man in Paris in 1943, packing crates, writing letters to strangers in American farmhouses, trusting people he'd never met with the things he'd spent his life accumulating. She thought about what it meant to make that kind of arrangement, knowing you might not be the one to undo it, knowing the undoing might fall to someone you couldn't have imagined. She looked at the wall of her kitchen, at the replastered ceiling, at the windows she'd reglazed. She had not imagined herself either, she thought. Not this version of herself. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The appraisal process began in the 4th week. Celeste arranged for 2 independent appraisers to visit the property, both of whom had experience with old masters and both of whom had, she made clear to Teresa, agreed to strict confidentiality. Their names were Dr. Audria Weston from the Fine Arts Institute in Boston and a man named James Calloway, who had spent 30 years at 2 major auction houses before going independent. They came on the same day, separately, and worked in the room for most of it. Teresa had told no one except Donna about what the preliminary assessment suggested. Not Hector, who had been down in the room and had seen the paintings and was discreet enough not to ask questions, but was not incurious. Not Barb from the feed store, who had parked in the driveway twice now under the pretense of checking whether Teresa needed anything, and who had a gift for extracting information from people who hadn't intended to share it. Not Greta, who had called once since the discovery and whom Teresa had talked to for 3 minutes about nothing. She had told Donna because not telling Donna would have been a form of cruelty she wasn't capable of. Donna had been silent for a very long time after Teresa described what Celeste had said at the kitchen table on the 3rd visit. Then she had said, in a voice that was almost entirely steady, Teresa. I know, Teresa had said. That's I know. Another silence. Then Donna had said, "Do you need anything?" Which was what Donna said when the situation had exceeded her vocabulary for it. Teresa had said yes. I need someone to pick up Marisol on Thursday because the appraisers are coming and I don't want her here. Donna had said of course, and that had been the end of that conversation, which was one of the most important conversations Teresa had ever had. Teresa spent that day doing her bookkeeping work at the kitchen table because she needed the money from her clients and because sitting and waiting would have been worse. She answered emails and reconciled accounts and prepared quarterly reports and listened to the sound of people moving around below her feet and tried to keep her mind on the numbers in front of her. Hector came by at noon and sat with her and drank coffee and didn't ask questions. She appreciated that more than she could say. Marisol came home from school at 3:15 and did her homework at the other end of the table and told Teresa about a project they were doing on local history and about how her friend Juniper had gotten in trouble for feeding Biscuit the hamster a potato chip. At 5 o'clock, Dr. Weston and Calloway came up from the basement and sat at the kitchen table. Marisol had gone upstairs to her room. Hector had gone home. It was just Teresa and these two people who had spent the day looking at things she'd found under her floor. Calloway spoke first. He was a compact man in his late 60s with the precise speech of someone who had spent a career choosing words carefully in rooms where imprecision had consequences. I want to preface this by saying that every number I give you today is preliminary and subject to full technical analysis and provenance verification. I'm giving you what I'm confident in, not the full picture. Do you understand that? Yes, Teresa said. He looked at his notes. Of the 34 crates, I examined the contents of 22 today. Of those 22, 14 contain paintings I'm prepared to provisionally attribute to identified artists of significance. 3 contain works I cannot attribute with confidence today, but which are of comparable quality and period. 5 contain drawings and works on paper, several of which are extraordinary. He looked up from his notes. The 2 illuminated manuscripts are outside my specific area, but Dr. Weston has looked at them, and I'll let her speak to those. Dr. Weston was younger than Calloway, perhaps 40, with a stillness about her that matched Celeste's. She said, the manuscripts are 15th century. Flemish, I believe, based on the pigment palette and the iconographic program. They are in astonishing condition. I've seen manuscripts of comparable age that have been in continuous museum care for 50 years that are in worse shape than these. She paused. Each of them, individually, would be a significant acquisition for a major institution. Calloway said, the paintings I've attributed provisionally include 3 works from the Dutch Golden Age, one of which I believe is attributable to a student of Rembrandt's circle and 2 of which may be by identified masters of the second tier, significant names. There are 2 Italian works I'm attributing to the Venetian school, 16th century. There is 1 French work, 18th century, that I have a strong preliminary attribution for, an attribution that if confirmed would be significant. He set his notes on the table and looked at Teresa directly. I'm not going to give you a total number today. What I'll tell you is that the preliminary total for the 22 crates I examined, based on conservative current market estimates for works of this quality with provenance documentation, is in the range of $200 million. The 12 crates I haven't yet examined could revise that figure considerably. Teresa looked at the table. 200 million was a number she had no real scale for. It was a number from a different category of existence, a number that belonged to the same universe as the other numbers she'd been reading about in her 2 weeks of research, the auction records, the insurance valuations, the discovery stories she'd found online. Those stories had seemed, when she was reading them, to be about a kind of world that had no contact with her own. 200 million, she said. Provisionally, Calloway said. Minimum. With the provenance documentation and the Brenner connection, if that can be verified, and if the legal situation resolves cleanly, the figure could be considerably higher. What legal situation? Celeste, who had come back from a phone call outside in time to hear the last exchange, sat down at the table. This is what I needed to talk to you about, she said. The provenance question. Tell me, Teresa said. Art that was displaced during the Second World War, specifically art that belonged to Jewish collectors and dealers who were targeted by the Nazi regime, exists in a complex legal landscape. There are international agreements, there is ongoing research, there are organizations that have spent decades tracing the ownership history of works that were looted or forced from their original owners. If the Brenner collection was evacuated rather than confiscated, which is what the correspondence suggests, that's a different legal situation than looted art. But it's not simple. What does that mean for me? It means, Celeste said carefully, that the first question is not what this collection is worth. The first question is who it belongs to. If Wilhelm Brenner had heirs, if there are living descendants who can be identified, they have a claim. Not necessarily the only claim, not necessarily a claim that supersedes yours under current law, but a claim that needs to be investigated and addressed. Teresa looked at the letter again, the translation of Brenner's last words to Robert Hargrove. Keep them safe. I will come when I can. He never came, Teresa said. No, but he may have left people behind who didn't know where to look. Celeste met her eyes. I want to be clear about one thing. The right way to handle this is also, in the long run, the right way for you. A clean provenance investigation that identifies what happened and who has legitimate claims will result in a cleaner, clearer, more legally secure resolution for you than anything else. It takes time. It may be complicated, but it's the only path that actually ends well. Teresa was quiet for a long time. She thought about what it meant to find something and do the right thing with it. She thought about what it would mean to Marisol, watching her mother navigate this. She thought about a man in Paris in 1943 writing a letter to a farmer in Garfield County he'd never met, asking him to keep something safe. Find out what happened to him, she said. Find out if there are people who should know this is here. That's where we start. Celeste nodded. Yes, she said. That's where we start. The research took 3 weeks, conducted partly by Celeste's organization and partly by a historian named Dr. Miriam Cass at a university in New York who specialized in wartime art displacement. Dr. Cass had a database, she explained in a phone call with Teresa, one of several that had been compiled over decades from records captured by Allied forces, from testimonies, from correspondence preserved in archives across Europe that allowed for the tracing of dealers, collectors, and their holdings. Wilhelm Brenner appeared in the database. He had been born in Frankfurt in 1891. He had established his gallery in Paris in 1922, building over 2 decades a reputation as a specialist in Dutch and Flemish old masters. He had been married. He had had 2 children, a daughter named Elise born in 1924 and a son named Thomas born in 1927. Dr. Cass's voice on the phone was careful and exact, the voice of someone who delivered this kind of information regularly and had learned that precision was a form of respect. Wilhelm Brenner was arrested in Paris in November 1943, she said. He was deported to Auschwitz in early 1944. He did not survive. Teresa sat at the kitchen table in her replastered kitchen and held the phone and breathed. She thought about the last letter. About keep them safe. I will come when I can. She thought about Robert Hargrove reading that letter in this kitchen, or wherever he'd sat when he read his mail in 1943, and understanding that he was now the keeper of something that mattered enormously to a man he'd never met. She thought about Robert Hargrove sealing the hatch after the last crate was stored and packing the soil carefully above it and going about his life on this farm with this knowledge inside him. She thought about Roland Hargrove inheriting that knowledge from his father, keeping it the way his father had kept it, keeping it until he too was gone and the knowledge passed nowhere because there was no one left to pass it to. They had been custodians of a promise. Both of them, a farmer and his son, for 80 years. The promise had survived them, and now it had found its way to her, to a woman who had found the room by accident on a night in March when she was checking for standing water after a wet week. She pressed her hand flat on the table and breathed. His wife, Marie, Dr. Cass continued, survived the war by remaining hidden in Paris with assistance from a French family. She emigrated to the United States in 1946 with her daughter Elise. The son Thomas had been sent to England before the occupation and survived there. He later emigrated to Canada. Are there living descendants? Yes. Elise Brenner married in New York in 1951. She had 3 children. She died in 1998, but her children are living. 2 of them in New York, 1 in California. Teresa pressed her hand flat on the table. Do they know about the collection? Based on what I can find, no. The family's records suggest they knew of the gallery, knew that Brenner had dispersed portions of his inventory before his arrest, but the specific locations of most of those dispersals were either not known or were lost in the chaos of the post-war period. There is no record in any database I've checked of the Hargrove farmhouse in Garfield County as a known dispersal location. They've been looking, Teresa said. Some members of the family have, yes. There's a record in the art loss register of a claim filed in 1987 by one of Elise's children, a man named David Brenner. He filed a general claim for the known inventory of his grandfather's gallery, the works documented in pre-war exhibition records and invoices. It's a broad claim, unresolved, because the specific locations were unknown. Teresa looked at the window she'd reglazed, at the ceiling she'd replastered, at the kitchen that had been, when she moved in, a cold room with bare joists and plastic sheeting where the plaster had been. She thought about David Brenner filing a claim in 1987 for things his grandfather had tried to save, for things a farmer named Robert Hargrove had sealed in a room under a farmhouse and kept, and his son Roland had kept after him, and neither of them had apparently ever told anyone was there. I need their contact information, Teresa said. The family. I need to reach out to them directly. There was a brief pause on Dr. Cass's end. I can facilitate that, she said. But I want to ask, because it matters for how we approach this, what do you intend to say? Teresa looked at the letter from Wilhelm Brenner to Robert Hargrove, the translation still on the table in front of her, the last paragraph still sitting in her mind the way it had since she first read it. I'm going to tell them, she said, that their grandfather asked someone to keep a promise, and that the promise was kept. The call with David Brenner happened on a Tuesday evening, 3 days after Teresa had asked Dr. Cass to make contact. She'd expected it to be strange and difficult, and it was, but not in the way she'd anticipated. David Brenner was 68 years old, the son of Elise, the grandson of Wilhelm. He had a low voice, and he chose his words with care, the way people did when they were trying not to let emotion interfere with practicality and not entirely succeeding. He said, Dr. Cass told me you found something. Yes, Teresa said. And then she told him. Not the numbers, not yet. She told him about the room, about the crates, about the inventory in French with the German annotations, about the last letter from his grandfather to a farmer who had kept the promise without ever apparently telling anyone what he was keeping. There was a long silence on David Brenner's end. I've been looking for this for 30 years, he said finally. Not this specifically. I didn't know about this farm. But I've been looking for anything that was missing. There were records of what my grandfather had, pre-war exhibition catalogs, invoices, insurance documents. And then there were gaps. Works that were documented before the war that never showed up anywhere after. He paused. I always thought they were lost, or that they'd ended up in private hands somewhere, and the owners had chosen not to come forward. Your grandfather's last letter to the man who owned this farm, Teresa said, asked him to keep the collection safe until someone could come for it. I think Robert Hargrove kept that promise his whole life. And I think his son Roland kept it after him. They just never found a way to tell anyone what was here. Another silence. You could have sold these things, David Brenner said. Without telling anyone. Without any of this. Yes, Teresa said. Why didn't you? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about her daughter at the kitchen table, saying more important than treasure. She thought about the way the room had felt the first time she stood in it, the particular weight of something that had been waiting. Because they weren't mine to sell, she said. They were kept for someone. I just didn't know who yet. David Brenner was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I need to tell my family. Yes, Teresa said. And then we figure out what comes next. What comes next turned out to be complicated in the specific, manageable way that things were complicated when the people involved all wanted to do the right thing, which did not mean easy, but did mean navigable. The Brenner family retained a lawyer who specialized in wartime restitution, a woman named Dr. Hannelore Fisher, who had spent 20 years navigating the legal landscape of displaced European art. Teresa retained Patricia Gould from a firm in the county seat who had no experience in art restitution specifically, but who was thorough, careful, and, crucially, charged a fee Teresa could actually manage. They spent a month trading documents, establishing the chain of ownership, correlating the inventory with the art loss register claim David had filed in 1987 and the pre-war records of Brenner's gallery. Of the 61 items in the inventory, 58 could be matched to documented Brenner holdings. 3 remained ambiguous, possibly acquired after the known records ended, possibly acquired through channels not yet traced. The legal question of ownership was genuinely complex. Teresa had purchased the farmhouse through a legitimate county land transfer program. Everything on the property was legally hers under the terms of the transfer. The artworks had been placed on the property voluntarily by their owner, not stolen, not confiscated. The legal claim of the Brenner heirs was a moral claim, a historical claim, a claim grounded in the particular tragedy of what had happened to Wilhelm Brenner and his family. But it was not. Dr. Fisher acknowledged in a meeting attended by both legal teams and Teresa and David Brenner and two of David's cousins, a clear-cut legal claim that would necessarily prevail in a court. Teresa sat at the end of the table in Dr. Fisher's conference room in New York and listened to the lawyers lay out the landscape, and when they were done she said, "I don't want to go to court." Everyone looked at her. "I didn't find these things so I could fight over them," she said. "I found them so I could do the right thing with them." She looked at David Brenner. "Your grandfather wrote a letter asking a farmer to keep his collection safe until someone came for it. You're here. Let's figure out what's fair." David Brenner looked at her for a long moment. He had his grandfather's eyes, she thought, or what she imagined his grandfather's eyes might have looked like. Clear and steady and carrying something old. "What would fair look like to you?" he said. Teresa had thought about this. She'd thought about it for weeks, at the kitchen table late at night, on the porch in the evenings watching Marisol run in the yard. She'd done the math in ways that had nothing to do with money and ways that had everything to do with it, because she was a bookkeeper and she understood that money was real and that pretending otherwise was a luxury she didn't have. "A share," she said. "Not the majority. These belong to your family. They should go back to your family. But I bought a broken farmhouse and fixed it and found something that had been hidden for 80 years, and I did the right thing when I didn't have to. A finder's share. Whatever that looks like in this context." The room was quiet. David Brenner's cousin, a woman named Rachel who had been silent for most of the meeting, said, "We can work with that." They worked out the terms over the following 6 weeks. The Brenner family would reclaim the collection, all 61 items, with full provenance restored. The items would be handled through a major auction house, with a portion donated to an institution specializing in the preservation of Jewish cultural heritage, which was a term that had been in Wilhelm Brenner's will, drafted in 1939 when he had evidently already understood that his situation was deteriorating. During those 6 weeks, the secret held. Not easily, and not without effort, but it held because the people who knew understood why it had to. Celeste had been firm on that point from the beginning. An unresolved legal situation with an art collection of this magnitude, if it became public before the provenance questions were settled, would attract the wrong kind of attention. Reporters, speculators, people with distant claimed connections to either the Hargrove family or the Brenner Gallery. It would complicate what was already complicated, and it would make it harder, not easier, to do the right thing. So Teresa told no one new. She went to Clement and did her grocery shopping and sat at the kitchen table doing her bookkeeping work and drove Marisol to and from school on the days the bus schedule didn't work and went to the 2 birthday parties Marisol was invited to in April and smiled at the other parents and kept the secret in her chest like something that needed careful handling. Barb from the feed store cornered her in the parking lot of the Dollar General in late April and said, "Something's going on at your place. I see cars coming and going." "Structural assessment," Teresa said. "Making sure the foundation work I did is holding." Barb looked at her with the expression of someone who suspected this was at least partly true and possibly entirely false. "Fine," she said, "but you call me if you need anything." "I mean it." Teresa said she would, and she meant it. And that was the most honest conversation she had that month with anyone except Donna. The meeting with the Brenner family happened in New York in early May at Dr. Fisher's office, a week before the settlement was finalized. David Brenner was there, and 2 of his cousins, Rachel and a man named Peter who had flown in from California. Their lawyer was there, and Teresa's lawyer was there, and Celeste was there as the technical specialist. Teresa had driven to New York the night before and stayed at a motel near the highway, because she couldn't afford anything closer. She had worn the same black blazer she'd worn to her job interviews 2 years ago, which still fit, and she'd sat in the motel room the night before and thought about what she was going to say. In the end, she hadn't needed to prepare anything. David Brenner had crossed the room when she came in and shaken her hand with both of his. The way you held someone's hand when what you wanted to convey was larger than a handshake could carry, and he had said, "I looked at photographs of the room last night. Dr. Marsh sent them to us." Teresa nodded. He said, "I showed them to my mother before she died. Not the real ones, she was already gone. But I showed them to a photograph of her." He paused. She never stopped talking about the gallery, about what her father had built. He cleared his throat. I just wanted you to know that. Teresa looked at this man who was 68 years old and had spent 30 years looking for what she'd found in a farmhouse basement in March. She thought about what it meant to carry something for that long, to keep looking without knowing if there was anything to find. You kept looking, she said. He looked at her. You kept the promise, he said. The lawyers let them talk for another few minutes before the meeting had to begin, and Teresa was glad of it. Some things needed to happen outside the official record. Teresa would receive 20% of the net proceeds from the sale, a finder's acknowledgement formalized in the settlement agreement and reflecting both her legal position and what everyone in the room privately agreed was the moral reality of the situation. The preliminary appraisal had put the total collection at $290 million, a number that had climbed from Callaway's initial estimate as the remaining 12 crates were opened and assessed. With provenance documentation restored and the historical narrative of the collection's survival intact, the auction house projected that some works would perform above appraisal, not below. 20% of $290 million was $58 million. Teresa sat in her kitchen the evening after the settlement was signed and looked at that number on the document in front of her, and then she looked at the ceiling she had replastered herself and the window she'd reglazed and the porch boards that Dale had helped her replace. She thought about the morning she'd made the $500 payment to the county land office, about sitting in that parking lot afterward crying for 4 minutes, about how she'd timed it, for minutes, as though grief had a reasonable limit she was entitled to observe, about how she'd driven home afterward and sat down at the laptop and started watching videos on porch board replacement, because motion was the only thing she knew how to do when the alternative was stillness, and stillness, in those early months after Marco, had felt like disappearing. She thought about the evening she'd told Marisol they were moving into the farmhouse. Marisol had been silent for a moment, the way she was sometimes when she was processing something, and then she had asked whether there would be a yard. There's a yard, Teresa had said. And a barn? An old one, yes. Can I have a dog? Teresa had said they'd talk about it, which was a non-answer that Marisol had accepted without complaint, because she had learned, the way children did, to read the difference between no and not right now, and we'll see when the time comes. She thought about the first night in the farmhouse and the sleeping bags, the space heater's orange glow in the corner of the southeast bedroom, Marisol's arm thrown across her in sleep. She had lain awake that night looking at the ceiling of the room she'd chosen because it had the best plaster and the most intact window, and she had felt, not peace, she hadn't had peace in a long time, but something close to alignment. The feeling of being in the right place, even if the place was hard. She thought about all of that, and then she looked at the number on the document again. $58 million was not a number she had ever expected to occupy the same room as her own life. She was a woman who kept track of every dollar, who had learned to make the math work in ways that required precision and acceptance, who had woken up in the night more than once running numbers in her head, because the numbers were the thing you could control when nothing else was. 58 million was a number that ended that particular kind of wakefulness permanently. But it was also, she thought, the smallest part of what had happened. The smallest part was the money. The larger parts were the room, and the crates, and Wilhelm Brenner's letter, and David Brenner's voice on the phone when he said, "I've been looking for this for 30 years. The largest part of all was the thing she'd have no easy way to explain to anyone who asked, which was that she had bought a broken house because something in her believed the bones were good, and she had been right in a way that went so far past what she'd imagined that she couldn't yet see the full edges of it. She sat there for a long time in the quiet kitchen. Then she heard Marisol coming downstairs, one foot then the other in the careful way she navigated the steps that still squeaked on the left side, and Teresa put down the document and turned toward the sound of her daughter coming. Marisol appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, looking at her mother with the direct assessment of a child who knew something significant had been happening for weeks and had been patient about not knowing what. "Is it done?" Marisol asked. "Most of it," Teresa said. Marisol came and sat across from her at the kitchen table. She looked at the document, at the number visible on the page, though she couldn't read the full context of it. She looked at her mother's face. "Are we going to be okay?" she said. Teresa had been asking herself a version of that question for 2 years, since the morning the hospital had called, since the life insurance ran out, since the first letter from the medical collection agency in its slightly different shade of white envelope. Are we going to be okay? Was the question underneath all the other questions, the one that ran beneath the noise of daily survival, like a current you felt without always seeing. She looked at her daughter across the kitchen table in the farmhouse they had fixed with their own hands and other people's goodwill, in the house that had sagged and leaned and smelled of rot, and had bones that were good beneath all of it, the house that had been everyone's idea of a mistake. Yes, she said, we're going to be okay. Marisol looked at her for another moment with that clear, measuring attention. Then she said, can I have a dog now? Teresa laughed. She laughed for longer than the question warranted, the kind of laugh that has accumulated weeks of pressure behind it and comes out with more force than intended. And Marisol watched her with a small smile at the corner of her mouth, the expression of someone who had said the right thing and knew it. Yes, Teresa said finally. You can have a dog. Marisol accepted this with a gravity appropriate to the weight of the decision. She nodded once. She slid off the chair and came around the table and put her arms around her mother's shoulders from behind, her chin resting on the top of Teresa's head the way she'd been doing since she was tall enough. They stayed like that for a while in the kitchen that had been a cave and was now just a kitchen, in the house that had been a mistake and was now just theirs. Outside, the yard was dark and the barn stood where it had always stood and the fields stretched away toward the road where the mailbox had once fallen sideways into the blackberries. Teresa had put up a new mailbox in February, a plain one, nothing fancy. It had their name on it in stick-on letters she'd bought at the hardware store. VNN, for letters, level and straight, visible from the road. She had not known, standing in that hardware store in February choosing between letter sizes, that in a few months her name would be on a legal document alongside a number that changed everything. She had not known that the farmhouse she was standing in would turn out to hold the answer to a question a family in New York had been asking for 30 years. She had not known any of it. She had only known that the bones were good and the price was something she could reach, and the decision, once made, was hers to live inside of. That was enough. It had always been enough. It had just taken a while to find out what it was enough for. The story broke on a Thursday morning in June, 6 weeks after the settlement was signed. It came out the way these things came out when they were handled carefully, not through a leak, not through someone talking out of turn, but through a coordinated announcement that Celeste and the Brenner family's communications team had spent 3 weeks preparing. A press release went to major news outlets simultaneously. The auction house issued a statement. Dr. Miriam Cass gave a brief interview to a cultural journalist she trusted. And at 9 in the morning, Teresa's phone began to ring with a frequency and persistence that made it clear the previous 9 months had been, in terms of public attention, absolutely silent by comparison. She had been warned. Celeste had sat with her at the kitchen table 2 weeks before the announcement and walked her through what to expect. There would be a lot of press, she said. A lot of it will want to make you a symbol of something. Some of it will get the story wrong. Some of it will try to make the Brenner family into the secondary characters and you into the primary one, or vice versa, and neither version is entirely fair to anyone. She'd paused. How you choose to handle that is yours to decide. But decide before it starts, not after. Teresa had thought about that for 2 weeks. What she'd decided was this. The story she was willing to tell was the honest one. She would not perform grief or gratitude or transformation for an audience. She would say what was true. She would say that she'd bought a broken farmhouse because she needed a home and couldn't afford a good one. She would say that she'd found something under the floor. She would say that the right thing to do had not been difficult to identify, only to execute, and that she'd had help. She would say, every time she was given the opportunity to say it, that the collection belonged to the Brenner family and that the return of it was the most important part of what had happened, not the number attached to her name. She had also, on the advice of Patricia Gould, agreed to one interview. A single long-form conversation with a journalist named Yvette Morris from a national magazine, conducted at the farmhouse, published the same week as the announcement. Teresa had read Yvette Morris's previous work and thought she wrote about people rather than at them, which was the distinction that mattered. The morning the story broke, she drove Marisol to school, as usual. She did not have her phone out. She listened to Marisol talk about the hamster, which had been replaced over the winter by a second hamster also named Biscuit. This one with a slightly different coloring, a fact that the class had noticed, and that Marisol reported with the satisfaction of someone who had been paying attention when others hadn't. She kissed Marisol at the school door and watched her go inside. Then she sat in the parking lot for a few minutes with the phone face down on the passenger seat. Then she picked it up. 47 missed calls. 83 text messages. 6 voicemails. Emails she couldn't count at a glance. She called Celeste first. "You've seen the coverage," Celeste said. "I've seen the call volume. It's significant. The Brenner angle is what's driving it. The wartime provenance story. The auction house statement got picked up by every major outlet. You're going to be asked for comment by people you've never heard of today. Don't say anything to anyone except through Patricia or me. Not on your doorstep, not in a parking lot, not to a neighbor." "Barb," Teresa said. "Especially not Barb," Celeste confirmed, which suggested she had understood Clement's social dynamics with some accuracy. Teresa drove home. There was already a news van parked at the end of the driveway. A man with a camera was standing near it. Not on her property, but close enough to make the point. She pulled in without looking at him and went inside. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the yard and thought about what she'd expected the morning after buying the farmhouse, which was more of what came before it. More scarcity and more effort, and more making the math work in ways it barely wanted to work. She had not expected any of this. Not the room, not the collection, not the name on a settlement document next to a number that had required her to sit down when she first saw it written out. She had not expected to become, in the space of a week, a story that people and places she'd never been were reading over breakfast. The phone rang every few minutes throughout the morning. She let most of them go to voicemail. She answered the ones from Patricia Gould, who was fielding the press inquiries methodically, and from Celeste, who had already been on 2 morning radio programs discussing the Brenner collection's significance, and from Donna, who called 3 times in an hour with the energy of someone who had been sitting on a secret for months and was now processing the release of that pressure at speed. "Everyone knows," Donna said on the 3rd call. "Everyone knows," Teresa agreed. "Barb called me this morning," Donna said. "She already knew, somehow. I don't know how she already knew." "Barb," Teresa said, "has always known things before other people know them. I stopped questioning it." "She said she's proud of you," Donna said. "She said that specifically. She wanted me to make sure you knew." Teresa looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at the barn with its repaired roof, at the vegetable garden Marisol had planted along the south fence, at the farmhouse's own exterior where the siding she'd treated in March had weathered the spring well, and the porch stood level and solid in the morning light. "Tell her thank you," Teresa said. "I mean it." The news van at the end of the driveway was joined by a second one by noon. She watched them from the upstairs window with a detachment she had not expected to feel. They were there because a story had happened, and the story was real, and she understood that people's interest in it was not unreasonable. A homeless woman's wartime art cache recovered through a county land transfer program. A promise kept across 80 years and 2 generations of a family who'd never told anyone what they were keeping. These were real things, and they had the quality of real things, which was that they were complicated and not entirely reducible to a headline. The headline, she'd already seen, was usually some version of, "Broke single mom finds $290 million art treasure under farmhouse floor." She thought about that framing. Broke was accurate. Single mom was accurate. The treasure part was accurate. The underneath it all was the part that mattered and the part that was hardest to fit into a headline. She called Marisol's school and asked them to hold her at the office at the end of the day rather than sending her out to the bus. She drove to pick her up herself, taking the longer route that avoided the end of the driveway, and sat in the school parking lot until the final bell, and watched her daughter come out the door with Juniper and another girl Teresa didn't know yet, the 3 of them talking with the close, animated attention of people sharing important news. The Yvette Morris interview had been conducted the week before. Teresa had spent a day cleaning the farmhouse for it. Not the kind of cleaning she did when guests came, the kind she did when something mattered. She had cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, polished the window she'd reglazed, put fresh flowers on the table from the perennial bed she'd planted along the south wall in April. She had dressed in clothes she owned rather than borrowed. Marisol had been at Donna's for the day. Yvette Morris had arrived with a photographer and a small recorder and had shaken Teresa's hand and said, "I want to understand the house before I understand anything else. Can you show me around?" So Teresa had shown her. Every room, every repair, every place where the work she'd done was visible. The porch boards, some original and some new, the difference in color telling the story of which were which. The bathroom floor, rebuilt on a sound subfloor. The kitchen ceiling, replastered in 2 sessions because the first had cracked when it dried, and she'd had to learn why and do it again. The upstairs bedroom where she and Marisol had slept in sleeping bags for 2 weeks before the second space heater arrived from Donna's garage. Yvette had stood in each room and listened and looked and asked questions that were specific and unhurried. She had asked about Marco, not for his death exactly, but for who he was, what he'd been like, what the two of them had wanted that they hadn't had time to build. Teresa had answered that. It had been harder than she expected, and she'd been glad Marisol wasn't there. She had also asked about the year before the farmhouse. The year in Donna's spare bedroom, Teresa and Marisol in the same room, the coffee can savings, the medical debt letters. She had asked it not to generate pity but to understand the specific weight of what Teresa had been carrying and the specific context of the decision she'd made. Teresa had answered that too. She had said that the year in Donna's house had been characterized by a kind of arithmetic that felt like it would never balance, where every number pointed to an outcome that was smaller than what she needed. She'd said that the farmhouse listing had been the first time in a year that a number had pointed in a different direction, and that she hadn't known whether to trust it, but that she'd decided trusting it was the only move available to her, and that sometimes the only move available is enough. Yvette had written that down exactly. She had shown Yvette the basement, the hatch, the room, which was empty now, the crates and the cabinet documents carefully transported to the auction house's conservation facility 3 weeks prior. The workbench still present, the shelving still there. The empty room looked different without the crates. Larger and quieter, more obviously ancient. The fieldstone floor caught the light from the LED work lamp Yvette's photographer set up, and the room had a stillness to it that Teresa thought was not just the absence of people, but the presence of all that had happened in it. "This is where you found them," Yvette said. "Yes." What did it feel like? Teresa had thought about that. She had thought about how to say something true rather than something that sounded good. She said, "It felt like responsibility before it felt like anything else. Like something had been put in my hands that I hadn't asked for and couldn't put down." Yvette looked at her. "And now?" Teresa looked around the empty room. The shelving still held the shape of the crates that had been there. The workbench still had the tools, which Calloway had said should be photographed and donated to a conservation museum as artifacts in their own right. The leather roll with the date on the inside of the flap. "Now it feels like the room knows it did what it was built to do," Teresa said. The article had run the same morning as the announcement. Teresa had read it twice the night before it went live, in the early hours when she couldn't sleep, on her phone in the kitchen. Yvette had written about her with an exactness that was not cruel and not soft, the exactness of someone who saw people as they were and found that sufficient. She had written about Marco without sentimentality. She had written about the farmhouse as a character in the story, which it was. She had written about the Brenner family and Wilhelm Brenner's letter and what it meant that a promise made in 1943 had survived 2 generations of custodians and 1 house fire in 1971 that had apparently taken out the barn's north wall but left the farmhouse untouched. That detail, about the 1971 fire, had come from a local history archive that Yvette had found. The barn's north wall, the one Teresa had seen blown out with the boards missing, had been damaged by a small fire caused by an electrical fault. Roland Hargrove had repaired it himself over 2 summers. The farmhouse had never been touched. The hatch, 30 feet away and 8 feet underground, would not have been affected even if it had. Teresa had read that detail and sat for a while with what it meant. The things that had nearly not survived and had. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The first call she had not been warned about came from Greta. It was the 3rd day after the announcement. Teresa had by then declined 14 interview requests through Patricia Gould, spoken with 2 outlets who were already publishing pieces based on public documents, and wanted a quote she declined to give, and had a long conversation with Donna that had mostly consisted of Donna saying her name repeatedly in tones that moved between wonder and something that took a while to identify as pride. Greta called on a Tuesday evening. Teresa almost didn't answer. She answered. Greta was quiet for a moment after Teresa said hello, the particular quiet of someone organizing what they intended to say. Teresa waited. "I saw the magazine," Greta said. Teresa said nothing. "And the news." Greta's voice was careful in a way it had never been before, a way that cost her something. "I've seen quite a lot about it." Teresa still said nothing. She was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the yard where Marisol was playing with the dog they had gotten in May, a brown and white mixed breed from the county shelter named, at Marisol's insistence, Biscuit, a name that Marisol had apparently decided was the correct name for small mammals regardless of species. I said some things, Greta said, in the past year and a half. About your decisions. About the house. Yes, Teresa said. I want you to know. Another pause, longer this time. I was wrong. Teresa watched Marisol throw a stick for the dog, who retrieved it and then sat down with it rather than returning it, which was a pattern that had been consistent since the day they brought him home, and which Marisol found hilarious rather than frustrating. I know you were trying to look out for Marisol, Teresa said. I know that's where it came from. I was trying to look out for myself, Greta said, with an honesty that surprised Teresa. Trying to feel like there was still something I could manage after Marco. It wasn't fair to you. Teresa breathed. No, she said. It wasn't. But I understand it. There was a long pause. Then Greta said, Marco would have been. Another stop. He would have thought you were extraordinary. Teresa looked at the window she'd reglazed, at the ceiling she'd replastered, at the kitchen that had been a cave. She looked out at her daughter in the yard with the dog. Thank you, she said. That matters. They talked for another 10 minutes, cautiously, with the particular care of two people who had not treated each other well and were finding their way towards something different. It was not a reconciliation in any dramatic sense. It was more like a beginning, a first step on ground that had been impassable and had thawed enough, finally, to walk on. When the call ended, Teresa stood at the window for a while watching Marisol and Biscuit negotiate the stick situation, which appeared to have resolved in Marisol's favor. The evening light came through the window at a low angle and fell across the kitchen floor in a long stripe of gold. Dale came by on Saturday with a case of beer and a look on his face that combined sheepishness and genuine joy in equal measure. He stood at the kitchen door and said, I believe I owe you an apology. Teresa let him in. He sat at the kitchen table and looked around the kitchen with the attention of someone seeing it properly for the first time. He looked at the ceiling she'd replastered, and the window she'd reglazed, and the porch he'd helped with, and some other things he hadn't had a hand in. He was quiet for a while. The job listings, he said finally. The ones I left on the table. Teresa said nothing. I was scared for Donna, he said. She was scared for you, and when Donna is scared, she makes it practical, and when I am scared, I make it Dale's problem, and Donna's problem is usually me. So. He stopped. That was a roundabout way of saying I handled it badly. You handled it the way most people would have, Teresa said. That's a generous read. It's an honest one. He looked at her. I thought the farmhouse was a mistake, he said. I thought you were making a decision from desperation and dressing it up as courage. I was wrong about that. He looked at his hands on the table. I don't know exactly how I was wrong about it. Because it did come from desperation. It's not like you had other good options. Teresa nodded. But I think. He stopped again, working something out. I think maybe desperation and courage are the same thing sometimes. Or close enough that the difference doesn't matter. She thought about that. Yeah, she said. Maybe. They drank the beer on the porch in the evening light. Marisol came out and Biscuit followed her, and Dale threw the stick with more success than Marisol had been having, which Marisol observed with the scientific interest of someone noting a useful fact. The porch boards held, the new ones and the old ones both, the repair holding in the way good repairs held. The auction happened 8 weeks after the announcement. Teresa was not there in person. She watched part of it on a live stream on her laptop, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, while Marisol was at school. Celeste had offered to arrange for her to attend, but Teresa had thought about it for a week and decided no. The auction was the Brenner family's event. It was the return of something that had been taken. Her presence would have made it partly about her, and it was not partly about her. She watched the first lot come up. It was the portrait, the woman in the formal dress, the one she'd been the first to see in the room. The one whose paint surface had the particular depth of centuries, the brushwork still readable in the layers of pigment. The bidding opened at $4 million. It moved quickly. Teresa watched the numbers climb on the live stream. The auctioneer's voice measured and brisk, the bids coming from the room and from phones relaying buyers elsewhere in the world. 7 million, 9 million, 11. A pause at 11.5. Then 12, and the room went quiet for a moment, and the auctioneer's gavel came down. $12 million for a single painting that had sat in a wooden crate in a room under her floor since 1943. Teresa put both hands flat on the kitchen table and breathed. The auction ran for 2 days. Not all 61 items were sold immediately. Some were withdrawn for institutional donation. Some were held pending additional provenance verification. 2 were donated directly to a museum in Amsterdam that had been tracking them for 40 years. But the principal works, the paintings and the manuscripts, achieved results that exceeded the high estimates in every case. The final total was $312 million. Teresa had watched the second day from the same chair in the same kitchen, with the laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside it. She had watched a drawing, a figure study in chalk on paper that Dr. Weston had attributed to a student of Raphael's, sell for $4 million. She had watched one of the Dutch master paintings, the landscape with the pale sky and the specific controlled light she had stood in front of in that room 8 months ago, sell for $22 million. She had watched the 2 Flemish illuminated manuscripts, withdrawn from sale and donated to a museum in Ghent that had a connection to the scriptorium where they'd been made, leave the catalog to a round of applause from the auction room that she could hear through the tinny speakers of her laptop. She had thought about Wilhelm Brenner watching his collection be assembled over years, his eye trained on quality rather than quantity, the pleasure of finding the right thing and acquiring it and adding it to what he'd built. She thought about what it would mean to him to know that what he'd spent his life building had spent 80 years in a room under a farmhouse in Garfield County and had emerged intact, documented, returned to his family, given back to the world. She hoped that wherever that kind of knowing went, it got there. The calls from Patricia Gould came in stages, each one moving the number attached to Teresa's 20% upward from where it had been. The final figure, after fees and taxes and the various deductions that reduced large numbers to somewhat less large ones, was $61 million for $100,000. Teresa wrote it down in her bookkeeping notebook because that was how she processed numbers. Seeing them in her own handwriting made them real in a way that looking at a screen didn't. $61 million for $100,000. She looked at it for a while. She flipped back through the notebook to the page where she'd written down the farmhouse purchase. $500 deposit. $12,000 total purchase price. The column of repair costs that had accumulated across the winter, each entry specific and small, $40 for replacement glazing compound, $220 for lumber for the porch, $60 for the grout she'd used to repair the foundation crack on the east side. The hardware store receipt for the stick-on mailbox letters. The receipt for the second space heater. She looked at those numbers and then at the new one and thought about the distance between them. Not as a measure of luck or reversal, but as a record of what the year had cost, and what it had contained, and what it had turned out to be. She thought about $500 and a laundromat board and a sagging farmhouse that everyone had looked at and seen a mistake. She thought about bones. The good bones of a house that was worth more than it looked. The bones of a decision she'd made in a parking lot after crying for 4 minutes. The bones of a promise kept by 2 generations of a family she'd never met, for a man who had trusted a stranger because there was no other option, because the world had made trust necessary. She thought about what it meant to be the person at the end of that chain, the one the promise passed to without anyone planning it that way. She closed the notebook. Then she called Patricia Gould back and said, "Tell me what I do next. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." She paid off the medical debt first. Not because it was the largest thing, but because the envelopes in their slightly different shade of white had been arriving for almost 2 years, and she wanted them to stop. She called the collection agency from the farmhouse kitchen on a Wednesday morning, and when the representative answered, she said her name and her account number and said she was calling to pay in full. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that happened when a customer service script encountered something it hadn't anticipated. Then the representative said, "The outstanding balance is $12,418. "Yes," Teresa said. "I'd like to pay that today." She used a card that had been issued by the bank the previous week. A new account opened with a fraction of the settlement's first disbursement. When the payment was confirmed, she thanked the representative and ended the call and sat for a moment. $12,000 was less than 1/20th of 1% of what she'd received. It was a rounding error. And it had been, for 2 years, one of the specific shapes that fear took in her life. The envelope, the number, the arithmetic that never quite worked out. She did not feel triumph. She felt the particular relief of a weight removed, which was smaller than triumph and more real. She paid the remaining county land transfer balance, the $7,500 she'd been paying off monthly. She paid the credit card she'd used for the worst of the winter's emergency expenses, the ones she'd put on it knowing she couldn't pay them immediately, the ones that had been accruing interest at a rate that had seemed abstractly manageable and concretely wasn't. She set aside a year's worth of living expenses in a separate account and did not touch the rest immediately, because she had learned from 2 years of careful money management that decisions made from abundance were different from decisions made from scarcity, and that the transition between the two required time. She called her bookkeeping clients one by one and told them she was stepping back from the work. 2 of them asked if she was sure, in the tone of people who had come to rely on her and were not quite ready to adjust. She said she was sure and gave each of them 2 months' notice and recommended other bookkeepers she knew. It was not that she disliked the work. She had been good at it, and she'd been glad to have it. But she had other things to do now, and the clients deserved someone for whom this was the primary thing rather than the keeping afloat thing. What she did instead, in the mornings while Marisol was at school, was something she had not done in years. She read. She read without a time limit, without having to stop for a shift or a client call or the logistics of a life run on thin margins. She read at the kitchen table with coffee and in the afternoon on the porch that now had all its boards replaced and a pair of chairs she'd bought at the antique barn in Clement, which had turned out, once she looked properly, to have several things worth looking properly at. She had always read, but she had read in the way you do things when time is a resource you ration, quickly and with the awareness that the time could end. Now she read the way she imagined the rest of it was supposed to feel, with the pages carrying the full weight of her attention and nowhere else it needed to be. Marisol came home from school one afternoon in July and found her mother on the porch with a book and the dog asleep on her feet, and said, "Is this what rich people do?" Teresa looked up. "I'm not rich exactly." Marisol sat in the other chair. "What are you then?" Teresa thought about it. "Okay," she said. "We're okay. That's what we are." Marisol considered this with the seriousness she applied to important distinctions. "That's better than rich," she said. Teresa thought she was probably right. She thought about that word, okay, more than once in the weeks that followed. About what it meant in the context of a life that had been not okay for long enough that the difference was now measurable. The word was quiet and without drama, which was why she'd chosen it, and which was, she thought, exactly right. Not triumph. Not reversal. Not the specific before and after of the stories she'd been reading about herself in the press, which had a satisfying shape that was true in outline and slightly wrong in texture. The texture was this: she was the same person. The house was more finished. The number in the bank account was different by an amount that changed the practical conditions of her life in every measurable way. But the person at the kitchen table was continuous with the person who had pressed her hand to a stone wall in the basement of this house in March and felt the faint resonance behind it, the air on the other side, the suggestion that something was there that shouldn't be overlooked. That continuity was the thing she wanted to keep track of. She had been a person who looked at broken things and saw the bones. She wanted to stay that person, even now. Donna called on the afternoon after the first disbursement arrived. She said, with characteristic directness, "What are you going to do?" Teresa looked around the kitchen. "I'm going to finish the house," she said. "The upstairs bathroom still needs work. The barn roof needs proper repair. There are windows I haven't gotten to yet." Donna was quiet for a moment. "You know you could buy a different house. A house that doesn't need any of this." "I know," Teresa said. "But this is the house. This is the house." "Because there was no version of this that happened anywhere else," Donna said, slowly, working it out as she said it. "If you'd bought a good house, there'd be nothing underneath it." Teresa thought about that. About how the break in the bones was where the light had gotten in. "Yes," she said. "Exactly. The house got finished over the summer. Not quickly and not all at once, but steadily. The way things got done when you had time to do them right instead of time to do them cheaply. Hector brought in 2 of his guys for the barn roof, which they stripped and resheathed and reshingled in a week, working from first light until the heat got too strong in the afternoon. Teresa worked alongside them on the days she could and watched on the days she couldn't and made lunch for everyone, which was a thing she'd wanted to do from the beginning but hadn't been able to afford. The upstairs bathroom was done in July, a proper job, tile, and a functional vanity, and a new toilet that did not require a styrofoam cup in the tank. The cast-iron clawfoot tub had turned out to need nothing more than cleaning and resealing, the enamel pristine under its years of accumulated grime. And when she took the first bath in it, the evening the work was finished, she lay in the hot water and looked at the repaired ceiling and the new light fixture and the tile she'd chosen, because she liked it and not because it was the cheapest option, and she thought that this was what it felt like to stop surviving and start living, and that the difference was real and large. Marisol had her room properly finished. The walls painted the specific shade of yellow she had chosen from a paint chip display with the concentration of someone making a serious decision. There were bookshelves, real ones, built in by Hector along one wall, filled with the books that had been accumulating in cardboard boxes since Teresa had found, now that she could afford them, that her appetite for buying books was larger than she'd known when not buying them had been the only option. The dog had a bed in the corner of the kitchen. The yard had a vegetable garden that Marisol had planted in May, and that was, by August, producing tomatoes with a volume that exceeded anyone's planning. Teresa had taken up canning, which she'd learned from a YouTube tutorial and from Barb, who had come by in July with a canner and an opinion and had ended up staying for the afternoon, and whose opinion on the tomatoes had been that they were good but needed more basil, a piece of feedback Teresa had taken seriously. The local paper ran a piece in July. Not a major piece, a Clement-sized piece, written by the paper's one staff reporter, a young woman named Annie Cho, who had the particular intensity of someone who had gone into local journalism on purpose. She interviewed Teresa for an hour at the kitchen table and wrote a story that was factually accurate and that captured the house with a specificity that suggested she had paid attention to the right things. The headline was, "Local Woman's Farmhouse Held Wartime Art Cache Worth Millions." Barb taped it to the window of the feed store. Clement, which was a small enough town that most things became communal property quickly, processed the news with the combination of pride and bewilderment typical of small places encountering large events. People Teresa barely knew waved to her in parking lots. The woman who ran the pharmacy asked how Marisol was settling in. Two parents from Marisol's school stopped her after drop-off one morning and said, in a way that was entirely sincere and only slightly awkward, that what she'd done with the Brenner family was the right thing, and they wanted her to know they thought so. She thanked them both. She meant it. The school sent home a note saying that Clement Elementary's library needed updating and asking for community support. Teresa wrote a check. She did not write it in a way that was visible or announced. She wrote it because the library had 60 children who used it every day, and because she remembered, clearly, what it felt like to reach for a book and have it not be there. She remembered being 7 and 8 and 9, moving between houses, the library card the one thing she'd always made sure to update, because the library was the one place that was the same regardless of what address she was currently living at. Because whatever else changed, the books were there. She established a scholarship fund at the community college where she'd been taking night classes when she bought the farmhouse. She called it the Van Hargrove Fund, the two names together, because it seemed right that Roland Hargrove's custodianship of the promise was part of the story even if he'd never known it would end this way. The fund was for single parents returning to education. The application criteria were simple. You had to be enrolled, you had to need it, and you had to write a paragraph about what you intended to do with what you learned. She read every application herself. The first round had 11 applicants. She funded all 11. She read each paragraph with the attention she'd learned to give to financial documents, looking not for the right words, but for the true ones. A woman in her 40s finishing the nursing degree she'd left incomplete when her first child was born. A man of 32 taking accounting classes at night after back injuries changed what work was possible. A young mother who wanted to teach, who wrote that her daughter had asked why she went to school when she was already a grown-up, and that the answer she'd given, because there's always more to learn, had felt like the truest thing she'd said in a while. That one stayed with her longer than the others. Yvette Morris wrote a follow-up piece in October, 6 months after the first one. She came back to the farmhouse with the same photographer, and they spent an afternoon there. The house looked different, finished in ways it hadn't been in March, but also continuous with what it had been. The original structure still visible in the old bones of it, the work built on top of and around, and into what had been there from the beginning. Yvette stood in the kitchen for a long moment when she arrived and looked at the ceiling and the window and the floor and the porch visible through the window and said, "It's the same house." "Yes," Teresa said. Yvette stopped. "I thought it might feel different. More changed." Teresa looked around the kitchen. "It's more finished," she said. "But it's the same house. That was the point of keeping it." Yvette nodded slowly. She looked at the bookshelf Teresa had put up against the kitchen wall, filled with the books that had been accumulating since spring. She looked at the dog's bed in the corner, the dog himself currently asleep in it with the specific boneless quality of a dog in deep afternoon sleep. She looked at the crayon drawing Marisol had made in July and taped to the refrigerator, a picture of the farmhouse with the barn in the back and two figures in the yard, labeled Imoam and Me and Biscuit, the dog rendered as a brown oval with 4 lines beneath it. She showed Yvette the room. The crates were gone and the cabinet was empty, but the room itself was unchanged. The fieldstone floor, the cut stone walls, the shelving built into the stone with iron brackets. Dr. Marsh had recommended, and Teresa had agreed, that the room be preserved as it was rather than converted to any other use. There was talk of a small plaque, nothing formal, something that marked what had happened here without turning it into a monument. She hadn't decided on the wording yet. She stood in the room with Yvette and the photographer while the light from the work lamp filled the space with its clean white glow, the same lamp Dr. Marsh had brought on that first night, which he had left behind and which she had kept. "What do you do with a room like this after?" Yvette asked. Teresa looked at the shelving, at the empty spaces where the crates had stood. She looked at the workbench, at the leather roll with the date on the inside of the flap, which she had kept in place exactly as it had been found. "I think it stays as it is," she said. "I think it stays as a room that did what it was built to do and now gets to rest." Yvette looked at her. "And you?" Teresa thought about that for a moment. The question was what she did now, with this life that had been remade not by luck, exactly, not by a windfall in the ordinary sense, but by a decision made from necessity that had turned out to contain something no one had known was there. "I'm finishing what I started," she said. "The house isn't done. I'm not done." She paused. "I keep thinking about the bones. How Hector came here and knocked on walls and pressed his palms to the floor and told me the bones were good. And I believed him because I needed to believe him and because I'd looked at the foundation myself and I thought he was right. But I didn't know. I was making a decision on incomplete information with inadequate resources because it was the only decision available to me." She looked at the empty room. "That's most decisions," she said. "That's most of what people do. They make the best call they can with what they have, and they hope the bones are good, and they work on the rest as they go." She looked at Yvette. "I don't think what happened to me is a lesson about how things always work out, or how courage is always rewarded. I don't believe that. But I think it might be a story about how sometimes the broken thing and the valuable thing are the same thing. And you can't know what you have until you've done the work to find out." Yvette wrote that down. The piece ran the following month. Teresa read it the night before it published, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and thought that Yvette had gotten it right, the same way she'd gotten the first piece right, with the exactness of someone who saw people as they were and found that sufficient. David Brenner called the day after it published. He had read it, he said, and he wanted her to know that his family had read it too. His cousins Rachel and Peter, the children of Elise who was gone, the grandchildren of Wilhelm who had never come back. "My grandmother kept a photograph of the gallery on her wall until she died," David said. "The gallery in Paris, before the war. She never talked about it directly. It was just there." He paused. "I used to look at it when I was a child and wonder what it felt like to have built something like that and then lose it. Now I think I know a little better. Not lose it. Not exactly. Give it to someone to keep." Teresa was standing at the kitchen window looking at the yard. The garden was going to seed now. October, the tomato plants brown and spent, the beds needing to be turned over for winter. She'd do it this weekend, she thought. Get Marisol to help. He found the right person to keep it, she said. Maybe, David said. Or maybe he found a long chain of right people. Robert Hargrove, and Roland, and then you. Maybe that's how it works with some things. They pass through whoever they need to pass through until they get where they're going. Teresa looked at the barn with its repaired roof, at the farmhouse's south wall with the perennial bed she'd planted in spring, at the mailbox at the end of the driveway with the stick-on letters she'd put up in February, VNN, plain and level and readable from the road. Yes, she said. Maybe that's exactly how it works. She thought about Wilhelm Brenner, who had written a letter to a man he'd never met and asked him to keep a promise, and about Robert Hargrove, who had kept it, and Roland Hargrove, who had kept it after him, and about herself, who had bought a farmhouse for $500 because the listing was on a laundromat board and something in her had stopped and looked at it. She thought about all the places the chain could have broken. The 1971 fire in the barn that had come 30 feet from the hatch and hadn't reached it. The 11 years the house sat in county possession before she found the listing. The 3 years it had been on and off the market before she came along. The possibility that someone else could have bought it. Someone who wouldn't have known what they were looking at in the basement, who would have poured concrete over the hatch without examining it or demolished the farmhouse entirely and built something new and modern on the cleared land. The chain had held. Every link of it, from Brenner's letter in 1943 to her hand on the pry bar in March, had held. She did not think this was miraculous. She did not think it was luck in any simple sense. She thought it was the accumulation of choices made by people who, at specific moments, had decided that the thing in front of them was worth preserving. Robert Hargrove reading a letter from a man he'd never met and deciding yes. Roland Hargrove inheriting that decision and keeping it. And her, standing in a parking lot in November with $500 and a daughter asleep in the back seat, deciding that the bones looked good from here. Not miraculous, just a series of people who, when it mattered, had done the right thing with what was in front of them. She thought about Marisol asleep upstairs in her yellow room, with the bookshelves full of books and the dog asleep on the floor beside her bed because the dog had decided in June that his bed in the kitchen was a secondary option and had moved to the upstairs room without asking anyone's permission. She thought about Marco, who would not have been horrified, who would have stood in this kitchen and looked at this ceiling and this window and this floor and would have said, in the specific way he'd had of saying things that were true without needing to be elaborate about it. Yeah, that's you. That's exactly you. She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. The farmhouse settled around her the way old houses settled at night, the wood adjusting to the cooler air, the sounds of contraction moving through the walls and floors. She had learned, over a winter and a spring and now most of a summer, to hear those sounds not as the sounds of a structure failing, but as the sounds of a structure breathing. The same sounds she'd heard in February lying awake at 3 a.m, when she'd been afraid enough to need them to mean something bad. They had never meant something bad. They had just been the house doing what it had always done, adjusting and settling, finding its balance in the dark. She lay in her room and looked at the ceiling she could barely see in the dim light coming through the window. She thought about the room below the basement. The fieldstone floor and the cut stone walls and the empty shelving and the workbench with its careful tools. The leather roll with the date on the inside of the flap. The room that had done what it was built to do and was resting now. She thought about what she would write on the plaque, the one. She hadn't decided yet. She had been turning it over for weeks, trying to find the right words, the ones that marked what had happened here without making it larger or smaller than it was. She thought she might write something simple. Something that named the people rather than the event. Wilhelm Brenner, who trusted. Robert and Roland Hargrove, who kept the trust. And the room itself, which had been built to wait and had been patient for 80 years and had not failed at either thing. And maybe just that. No flourish. No lesson. Just the names and the fact of the room and the date the promise was made and the date it was kept. Some things didn't need a lesson attached. Some things were sufficient as themselves. The bones were good. They had always been good. She had just needed to find out. Spring came back to Sycamore Gap Road the following April, and with it the particular sound of the fields coming back, the red-winged blackbirds returning to the fence posts, the peepers starting up in the wet ground behind the barn at dusk. Marisol turned 8 in March. Teresa threw a party in the kitchen with 6 of her classmates and a homemade cake that leaned to one side in a way that Marisol found charming, and that Barb, who came uninvited and was welcomed anyway, declared a deliberate aesthetic choice. Biscuit wore a paper hat for approximately 4 minutes before removing it with the focused displeasure of a dog who had tolerated enough. The plaque for the room went up in April. Teresa had settled on the wording in January, not through deliberation, but through the kind of knowing that came when you stopped forcing it. She had written it on a notepad at 2 a.m. and read it back in daylight, and found it was right. It read, "This room was built in 1876 to hold what mattered." It held. The collection placed here in 1943 by Wilhelm Brenner of Paris was returned to his family in the spring of the following year. Robert Hargrove kept the promise. Roland Hargrove kept it after him. The room kept it still. Nothing more than that. A contractor she'd hired through Hector's recommendation installed it on the stone wall beside the workbench, a small rectangle of brushed bronze that caught the light from the work lamp and held it without glare. She went down alone the first evening after it was installed and stood in the empty room and read it once. Then she turned off the lamp and climbed the ladder and closed the hatch behind her. David Brenner visited in May with his cousin Rachel. They drove up from New York on a Saturday morning, and Teresa made lunch, and they sat on the porch in the spring light. The four of them, David and Rachel and Teresa and Marisol, who had been told who they were and had met them with the handshake Teresa had been teaching her since she was 5, firm and direct, looking at the person. Rachel had brought a photograph. The original, not a copy, in a small frame she'd carried wrapped in a sweater inside her bag. It was the gallery in Paris, the exterior, 1936, the awning up and the window display visible, and Wilhelm Brenner standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, looking out at whoever was taking the picture with an expression that was not quite smiling and not quite serious, somewhere between the two, the expression of a man who had built something he was glad of. Teresa held it carefully in both hands. She looked at his face for a long time. Then she handed it back, and Rachel wrapped it in the sweater again, and they sat together on the repaired porch of the farmhouse while the afternoon moved across the yard and the fields and the road, and no one needed to say anything that wasn't already said. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.